Chapter 25. A Different Brand of Justice. Vernico said, "Trevor, this is a reminder that you and I may both be called to testify. We should be more frugal with our personal thoughts in public." Trevor looked chastised and said, Yes, you are right. I tend to get going and I can't stop. It will be a tightrope walk campaigning for chairman of the Mars Frontier Council, and more so if I'm elected. I think we gave the press plenty to chew on today. They sat down with members of each of their company's legal departments. Van Leeuwan said, "I hope everyone is ready for this battle. This could be the most serious confrontation the frontier has had with the government sector. Something tells me that the time is right, though." The Haruda Metals chief counselor, Hoshiko Sugimoto, agreed. "Yes, it will be interesting to see who shows up to represent these suspects. Will they be retained privately or will they be government lawyers? We still do not know the status of the detainees. Are they government contractors or government personnel?" Eduardo Cardona, the VLC chief counselor, said, "Are they completely freelance?" "Well, for now, that should not prevent us from building our case. It could determine how we shape it or present it later, but we can get started with that, with what we have and what the forensics teams come up with." Hoshiko spoke to Eduardo and the rest of the group. "Must we let the JSO add their own forensics team? They're going to accuse us of planting evidence." Eduardo said, "This is all new territory. We have a secondary forensics team working the ships, also from a respected professional company. I say only if we end up naming a government entity as a defendant should we go so far to accommodate. Of course, if the defendants want to bring their own people in, we would have to make arrangements. If some government agency wants to be named as a defendant, then we'll do the same." Hoshiko added, "I agree with Eduardo. We might be putting the cart before the horse. I don't recall any government entity ever being hauled into a frontier court." "We could be making history," she smiled. Van Leeuwan said, "You folks know that if this is some kind of false flag operation or other shenanigans run by Earth governments, they won't want to have their grubby paw prints on it. There won't be paperwork or it will magically disappear. They won't allow us to subpoena any information because they will claim we don't have standing or the records are classified. If we can't get any records from the ships themselves, it is not likely we'll get them at all. If there is government involvement, of which I am confident, the best bet might be to get some of these guys to roll on their betters, and we could charge them with conspiracy personally. The frontier courts have a reputation for fairness, and where deals are not made for the well-connected. We have a fair amount of material from the logs, so let's keep our fingers crossed." Trevor asked, "Ms. Haruda, do you have anything at all on the incident you related of JSO harassing one of your mining outposts?" Hoshiko caught on immediately. "Yes, if we can establish a pattern of behavior." Vernico shook her head. "No, I believe they took everything when they left. That does not mean they did not miss anything. I will see that our people do more sweeps to see if we didn't miss something." Eduardo said, "Well, I don't think we can accomplish anything more here. Like I said, we will continue to build our case and keep an eye out for any surprises. I think the reporters are gone now, off filing their stories, so we should be safe." Van Leeuwan said, "Well, it will be nice to have an excuse not to talk to reporters." By evening, the news nets all had video of the alleged pirates in their cells at Viking Center. The cells were not brick, concrete, and metal. They were small, but not unlivable. There was nothing breakable or impossible to be properly cleaned and sterilized in the cells. The food was decent. These detainees were all dressed in street clothes or exoskeletons if they preferred Earth gravity. The clothing was not an obnoxious orange, yellow, striped, or designed with some other demeaning identifier. Each prisoner had a non-removable RFID wristband. These were men and women being held for trial. None of them had been convicted of anything yet. There were completely private rooms where advocates could meet with their clients. Unlike government-run or financed detention facilities, attorney-client privilege was respected at Viking Center. By treating prisoners this way, even the criminals had a grudging respect for an institution that treated them like human beings. There had never been an escape, but then again, crime was very low on the frontier. Each detainee facing trial was shown in the broadcasts from both VLC and the news nets. Suspects appeared with the names splashed on the screen where names were available, John or Jane Doe otherwise. There were log entries and video taken aboard the ships. Technicians were going through the videos and DNA databases to make identifications. It was a wish of VLC and Haruta that some would step forward to identify the detainees, or represent them, or both. This information could be telling in itself. It was hoped the video would fend off the usual charges from outsiders about vigilantism or lynch mobs. Everyone on the frontier who possibly could carried personal insurance, designed to be a guarantee of socially acceptable behavior. The policies listed in greater or lesser detail how the policy holder would conduct him or herself among fellow human beings. Anyone considering doing business with the policyholder would scan it in whole or in part to see what kind of person they were dealing with. If that person was not willing to commit to acting according to basic rules of civilized society, then they would likely not be able to trade or interact with their fellows, or would do so only at great difficulty. Those without the capacity for making rational decisions were dealt with in other more humane ways than cycling them in and out of jail. Insurance policies often listed specific punishments that the holder would agree to ahead of time. Built in to nearly every one of these policies was a guarantee that part of the premium would be dedicated to a voucher fund for those unable to pay for representation. If a detainee was at a point where he or she had no representation or could not afford it, then they would be given vouchers to pay any of the independent counselors taking part in the program. The choice still belonged to the person charged. Competition between detainees who wanted more for their money and insurance companies who wanted to pay less would set fair prices for the services required. Those paying for the policies also used the vouchers, so they had an interest in making sure the services were of quality. The vouchers themselves were handled by other independent agents, so the choice would be taken out of the hands of the plaintiffs. Earth-Mars lawyers did try cases on the frontier, but it could be a very unpleasant and unsettling experience. The defense lawyers usually had a better time of it. Perhaps this was because it was possible to win a case there. A few high-profile defense lawyers from Earth all but gave up their practices, telling the press that the Mars courts were the reason they became lawyers in the first place. They were not happy with milking their clients while being cowed into submission by the judges and prosecutors. It was rare that the more serious or violent crimes were committed in the new settlements. Almost everyone there was armed, for one thing, so that dampened a lot of antisocial behavior. As for white-collar crime, there existed interlocking chains of trust brought about by self-organization. Grassroots trust was based on the day-to-day interactions of the residents, rather than some feigned religious belief that their rights guaranteed by those extorting them every day. By and large, it was only prosecutors who had lost their faith in that system who crossed over. Most of those became defense attorneys, no doubt in some search for redemption. There were some exceptions to this rule, but it was difficult to get over the fact that the deck would not be stacked for them here. They had to change their whole mindset to understand that the judge or some politician was not going to bail them out. Charge stacking was not tolerated, and hiding evidence would actually land you in jail, as would collusion with a security agency to frame a defendant. Precedent had very little weight in the new settlements. The law, for the most part, was what had been pre-agreed to by the defendant or stated in the contract between the plaintiff and the defendant. Prosecutors were not allowed to recommend sentences, since that was the business only of the judge and or jury. Slowly, the 36 alleged pirates were identified. Several were named publicly by former police or military as having served with them. Others privately tipped VLC, Haruda, or Frontier Threat Management to the possible identities of suspects and the two other craft shown by Van Leeuwan. All of their portraits with their names or aliases were scrolling up the large viewer. Sir Richard Marchand of MI6 was once again monitoring the news nets in his study. He'd taken to locking the doors because his yelling would awaken the household or alarm the servants. First, there was a raid with their so-called pirates being taken along with their ships. Then this insult. Through various clandestine avenues, he and Malcolm Aldrich III had obtained representation for 2/3 of them. The remainder, feeling they could be burned at any time by their employers, were hiring their own or using vouchers. None of the actual employers or their representatives had shown up to visit them. The ones with pro bono representation knew it was the government paying for them, but none could talk about it. A government show trial would entertain the public, and they would all skate one way or another. No one could be certain what would happen here. Sir Richard sent a message to the man he thought should know what was happening on Mars. Commander Kynaston, could you kindly tell me just what is happening out there? This is your operation, isn't it? From what I am seeing, it is all coming apart at the seams. You still haven't told me how the crew of the Farnsworth got out, though it's not enough to satisfy those rebel colonists. We still have a huge PR problem out there, but it's much worse than that and hard to keep the lid on. This boycott has got everyone's nerves twisted. We're starting to get heat from our own people. I've lost track of how many have put in their 2 weeks' notices, and that's just for the British sector. Franco-German, American, Chinese, Russians, I'm getting complaints from everywhere. We're going to have to come up with some kind of repercussions, or we won't have anyone left. What's the name of that governor we have there now? Sciarri? That's it. Fabrizio Sciarri. You need to go rattle his cage. People in his sector are coming unhinged, protesting every consulate and government center. They're not making any distinctions right now. He's got to get some more police out there to deal with this. If he doesn't, it is only going to get worse for him. Now that we have this new trial of the century going on, a Mars century, and that's another thing. How could you lose 3 spacecraft from a remote base no one ever talks about? How could you let a top military base be raided like a kindergarten class? In any case, there's nothing you could do about the reservation right now, but let them keep reinforcing it. I need you to go pay a visit to those boys and girls in that detention center, or whatever they call it. I need you to put the fear of God into them about revealing our operations. Commander Kynaston thought to himself, do I need this? Do I really need this? Sir Richard was all fat and happy when this economy or that revolution was being toppled before tea time, and his inside information netted him another fortune. But now that someone was fighting back, he was having kittens. Sometimes they do fight back, and that's usually when they called him in. Sir Richard, Malcolm Aldrich III, Colin Dietrich, the U.S. Congress, the central banks, and the other front groups for the real pirates wanted their tribute as always. They were much too sophisticated and cultured for sabotage and wet work, so they created the CIA, MI6, CCP, mafia, corporate lawyers, and other surrogates. It was all part of the same soup at that level. Then again, Arthur Kynaston loved his work because he was very good at it, or at least he used to be. In a weird way, it was a bit exhilarating to have worthy opponents for a change, and that they didn't put any stock in Rhodes scholarships, an Oxford or Harvard PhD, knighthoods, or celebrity status. Even though Sir Richard was his boss, he thought he would let him stew for a few hours before he composed a reply. It was time to leave the reserve, and Sir Richard was right about that. There was nothing left he could do here. It was time to go back to the colonies. Still stinging over the repossession of the Kananobu Maru, Commander Kynaston thought he had better check on the 2 plasma driver ships in orbit about the moon. They were still there, nominally under his control. The problem with military ships was that there really were very few military space docks for them. Even the taxpayers were not ready to foot the bill for monstrosities available to the military alone, so they had to share. Most countries did not want another country's permanent spaceport orbiting over their heads, or worse, parked at geostationary L1 or L2. This was his problem. Having a couple of military cruisers guarding a couple of transport ships would only attract attention. He knew that being in the industry, Van Leeuwan and Haruta had plenty of friends and contacts who tracked shipping. They probably had a bolo out on these two already. Or maybe he was getting paranoid with those two getting into his head. It took some time, but ex-president Lavoisier of French Polynesia finally got back to his old chum, Governor Schiari. He wasn't in a great mood, but he knew Schiari was in a far worse position than just losing an election. Whether he knew it or not, Schiari was becoming another victim of Trevor Van Leeuwan. Lavoisier had just become a victim himself, because in his casual way, Van Leeuwan had just put an end to his career in the islands. He didn't know if he should tell Schiari to stay and fight, or to cut his losses and resign to fight another day. He was sure that Schiari did not know what was happening to him, only that he was likely being kept in his position long enough to be made scapegoat. This was the world they both lived in. It was a bubble of cocktail parties, inside deals, and the sacrifice of those with constitutions too weak for this lifestyle. Nobody ever thought it would happen to them. But if they kept their mouths shut about the great game, then there was always a chance for them to get back in. He had to know what Schiari's shadow handlers were telling him. Of course, those were the ones they had to fear the most. One could end up on the wrong side of an airlock or a muzzle, and the authorities would call it suicide. Lavoisier did not know his own status, if truth be known. He knew about things that could put him in a bad position, like out there in the jungle with 2 holes in the back of his head. There was no way he could have stuffed enough ballot boxes to beat the fisherman Orama. He had built up too many bad feelings in the islands, and it was time for him to go. His sponsors either did not splash enough money around, or several key people stopped taking it. It didn't matter. He was on the outside again, trying to work his way back in. From his first day in office, the fisherman began firing nearly everyone he had the authority to fire. He was making life uncomfortable and uncertain for the rest by his new policies. Schiari was having another harrowing day, trying to fill more and more vacated positions. This consulate or that one kept on him about their windows being smashed or their limousines being scratched or defaced. There were marchers 3 people deep outside their enclaves day and night. The police had taken off their badges and were marching with the protesters. Soldiers and bureaucrats were walking with signs saying, "Do the right thing," and apologies and restitution. Like all protesters dissatisfied with their government, they did not really know at whom to aim their anger and frustration. What was most ironic was the source of their disgruntlement was that they were not being treated with respect on an equal basis with others. Yet every day in their jobs they exploited and extorted their neighbors with the same disdain. That government employees were smashing things like 5-year-olds only gave more credence to their state of arrested development. The protesters in the new settlements did not have that problem because they did not have a government. Their enemy was easier to identify. The action they took was peaceful and simple. Schiari accessed the communication from his old friend Lavoisier with a heavy sigh. He was comforted they were not each suffering alone. Lavoisier appeared on the viewer. "Monsieur Schiari, my old friend. It has been a long time, no? I must apologize for being such a poor correspondent, but alas, the pressure of the office, eh? I see that you have your own unfortunate pressures, and perhaps via the same agent that has brought me so low at this time. Your message identified the culprit, if I remember. As you can see from the news nets, our Mr. Van Leeuwan and friends have been very, very busy, and I can tell you that the powers that be are not happy at all." The governor told the viewer to pause. This only made Schiari cringe even more. He was very aware that they were not happy with him, but they also told him to hold firm. What was he to do? As he got out of his large leather chair, he said, "Resume message." Lavoisier continued, "Alas, we both have problems, do we not? Perhaps we can help each other, as we did in the old days, n'est-ce pas? I am presently, as they say, at large. I cannot be one of those sad politicians who haunts the news nets. I must keep busy. I won't be complaining about how I am the real president of French Polynesia, or how my opponents cheated me. Spa's message, said Sciarri as he stopped to look out the window. He remembered how many times Lavoisier had saved him. He also remembered how on each occasion he let Maurice talk him into some risky and or forbidden venture that required them to be saved. Like it or not, Lavoisier had never failed to bail him out, and he needed bailing out. He probably would not have come this far without him. He just did not know what it would cost this time. He said, resume message. Now Lavoisier got down to business. What you need right now is a friend by your side, Fabrizio. I am going to be that friend and advisor when so many in your government are bailing out, as the Americans say. I do have experience with this Van Leeuwan character. I will be bringing you some of your favorite Italian wine and delicacies, along with some wonderful cognac. Oh, I forgot to tell you that I already have my passage booked on the PD Normandy, leaving tomorrow afternoon. I hope you still have plenty of room in the governor's mansion. It will be so wonderful to see you and work with you once again. I am at your service, mon ami. Well, he didn't really give me a chance to say yes or no, thought Governor Sciarri. But then that was always the way with Maurice. Typhoon Maurice, he was called. Or was that because of that debacle in the islands where the cleanup was worse than the original disaster? It was hard to keep it all straight these days. He wondered whether he would still be governor when his friend arrived. Checking his next scheduled appointment, he thought, perfect. This day just gets better and better. Commander Kynaston did not like waiting, and when his scheduled time came with Governor Sciarri, he just barged through the doors without being announced. In his role, he wore civilian clothes, but dressed well in his London-tailored resistance suits. He had ambitions of his own, and everything lately seemed to be tearing at them like rabid dogs. Governor Sciarri, what are you planning to do about the unrest in the nation's treaty sector? The people doing the damage out there are largely in your chain of command. Do you have any reliable people left in security? If this gets much worse, we will have to call in JSO troops, and nobody wants that. The governor told the commander, I am reprocessing everyone's files in the senior leadership and offering to pay incentives both temporary and permanent. I'm looking for the best people to move up so I can move the more timid to the side or out. You know this is only targeted at government workers, right? They are not angry for the usual reasons, like they and their unions need more money. We pay them plenty of money, but now they have far fewer places to spend it or have to wait in longer lines. Kynaston said, yes, but are you doing it fast enough? Why don't you just issue an order that all government workers get priority service? Sciarri was getting angry now. Do you know what you're saying? If I do that, the government workers might be happy for a while, but then everyone else will really be upset, like the taxpayers. They will turn on all of us. Kynaston was unmoved. So what if the taxpayers are upset? They're always upset about something, but they all know one thing. They need us. The governor took a deep breath, took out his pipe, and started preparing it. After lighting it, he took a few puffs and said, Commander, do they really? All they have to do is spend some time in the frontier tubes to know that is not true, and not just in the tubes. Van Leeuwan is going to develop the surface from here to his oil fields while interconnecting other tubes along the way. When that happens, we will only be an afterthought. This only angered Commander Kynaston. Nonsense. Those people need us to lead them. If we do not, there will only be chaos. They will start tearing themselves apart in no time. First it will be over claims, then it will be over whose courts they have to use, or some other thing. This is what people do, Sciarri. Sciarri was in a very zen mood today. This conversation with Kynaston was not progressing to any logical end. Commander, perhaps we should return to the beginning. What specifically is the nature of your visit here today? The commander calmed slightly. It is, as I asked initially, what are you going to do about the unrest? After another puff of his pipe, Fabrizio said, well, if it were up to me, I would apologize and pay the reparations to the families and to VLC. It seems that would end that chapter very efficiently and show a great deal of good faith. I don't represent the JSO or vice versa. In fact, who do they report to? Kynaston ignored the governor's last question and said, the rest of the nation's treaty council will never approve either an apology or reparations, Fabrizio replied. Commander, I'm well aware of that, and I promise you, I am being apprised hourly of all developments. I doubt you believed we would resolve this here on the spot, and I am thankful for your input. And one last thing, I do not appreciate this sector for which I am responsible as open ground for military vehicles where I am not involved. To the shock and surprise of both Kynaston and Sciarri, the commander had been handled and dismissed rather adeptly by the governor. Chapter 26. Know Your Enemy. The governor called in his administrative assistant. Sophia, I wish you issue a decree from the office of the Governor General, Nations Treaty Sector, Mars, April 19th, 137. The decree must read as follows. Due to the present state of unrest within the sector and annexes, a state of emergency has been declared. As such, all powers are devolved to the office of the Governor General, and as such, the Governor, Fabrizio Sciarri, assumes command of the physical and financial resources of this sector until the next session of the signers per the bylaws of the nation's treaty. This state of emergency is to take effect immediately. His administrative assistant, Sophia, had never seen the governor act so decisively. First order of business, Sophia. Please issue this statement, continued Fabrizio. On behalf of the nation's treaty sector and her residents therein, I wish to extend our deepest apologies to the crew of the Philo T. Farnsworth, their families, the Mars Frontier Council, and to the Van Leeuwan Corporation for the terrible way the crew were treated. We agree to pay the reparations and compensation as outlined by the demands of the Mars Frontier Council. Such payments will be made through the Mars Frontier Council from our government offices before close of business tomorrow. Sophia, who had been secretly seething at all of this nonsense, was now openly smiling as she wrote it all out on the official stationery. The governor said, Sophia, you must remember to issue the order of the state of emergency first. Wait for 1 hour, then release the statement of settlement. Time and date everything and run them by me first. We want to make sure everything is legal. The settlement offer will not be legal unless it goes last. Commander Kynaston was in his vehicle in transit back to the Equatorial Military Reserve, where he was bunking. The news nets announced the governor's state of emergency, and he was so excited he laughed and yelled aloud inside the pod. Later on, in the officers' dining room, he was told of Governor Sciarri's first order. He nearly threw his ice cream sundae across the room. Van Leeuwan, finally back in his office suite, heard the announcement and was surprised someone had actually come to their senses. The boycott worked, but would it stop or continue with their trial? No on the table. Folks were pretty hopped up about the pirates, but he preferred it played out in the courtroom. He felt the Mars Frontier Council should offer something in good faith in response, like calling off the boycott. There was no active resistance yet to those men being in custody, along with repossession of the Kananobu Maru and the Nakamura Maru. They would gain a lot of legitimacy by treating the incidents as separate. In anticipation of his election as chairman of the Mars Frontier Council, perhaps he should issue a statement/proposal as part of a campaign speech. This way, the statement could go out earlier, and he would take sole responsibility. The next morning, the news nets were all abuzz about the government capitulation or giving in to terrorists. The alternative media kept driving home the fact that those in the new settlements had the right to trade with whomever they felt like. That was the basic right of all human beings. Just how was refusal to trade being equated to terrorism exactly? Why offer a cogent argument when you can just apply labels and call people bad names? There was no violence against anyone in the government sector other than the careful selection of customers on philosophical grounds, i.e., not violence. Trevor did plan to be present along with Thornton to receive the official apology and reparations. Governor Sciarri did not want to quibble over the location. He just wanted to get this over with. They met ahead of the governor's deadline at 1 p.m. at the Pathfinder Ballroom, where the governor handed over the charity loot, plus letters made out individually to each of the crew. In addition, there was a letter for Trevor Van Leeuwan and a check for VLC. The governor made a brief statement of apology once again on behalf of himself as a representative, and others who were still unidentified would not step forward. Trevor thanked the governor for his show of good faith. We wish to thank the governor here today. He took a big step toward the restoration of peace and calm. As many of you know, I have been nominated as the new chairman of the Mars Frontier Council. As a member of good standing for many years, I would like to appeal to my fellows on the council and in the new settlements. Though we all know that the governor himself was not the instigator of this abuse of our neighbors, he did what was required to end this conflict honorably. I recommend that we end our boycott at this time as a reflection of our good faith. The happenings at Viking Center are not directly related to this incident, so I say we should separate them. Let's let justice for the alleged pirates be determined by a logical process, not mayhem by anyone on either side. Cheering went up inside the ballroom, though not everyone in attendance found this turn of events so exhilarating. Commander Kynaston could only imagine what his superiors back on Earth would be thinking less than 20 minutes from now. Commander Kynaston had spent the morning trying to arrange visits with each of the alleged pirates. In truth, he had recruited most of them and knew all of them very well. He had their dossiers, so he knew even a few things about them they would like to have forgotten. He knew all of their strengths and weaknesses intimately, which was why he was puzzled at the resistance he was getting. From what little he managed to glean from the few who did see him, he learned a few things. Nearly all of them had been visited by a lawyer, and many more than once. There was a scattering of family members who lived on Mars but probably had no idea what their loved ones really did for a living. Then there was one visitor who showed up time and again to see many of the detainees. The name was General Giamba Campbell. The commander did not know a lot about this general, but thought it was about time that he dug into his background. Was he a team player or a loose cannon? Arthur Kynaston was not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he had been around long enough to know that people did not always get to where they were without someone pulling the strings for them. There were many ways to accomplish this, which included bribery, blackmail, appeal to the ego, or just finding like-minded sociopathic personalities who would fall right in with the program. The schools were prime hunting grounds for those who could be groomed for academia, politics, business, banking, or whatever slot needed to be filled now or in the future. The people were inexperienced, easily influenced, flattered, or intimidated. Arthur Kynaston always wondered if his appointment to Dartmouth was on the up and up. He thought there were several more qualified to get into that Royal Naval College than he. There were several in his class washing out who he thought better as well. He did what he did because he liked the work and he liked the benefits. He was putting away a tidy fortune and had no real qualms about it. The Rhodes Scholarships were definitely a proving ground for the natural rulers of humanity. Early, massive financial backing of candidates, too wet behind the ears to know they were being prepared for service, would jump right in. Once they had that pin notifying people they were a member of the House of Representatives, all kinds of doors opened to them, and people literally got out of their path. Lawyers who could not put two sentences together, or hedge fund managers with no experience in finance, operated freely with little public scrutiny. Malcolm Aldrich III was one of the exceptions. He was very astute at business and technology, but he was utterly ruthless about taking those things from others nefariously when they had scooped him. He was a modern-day John D. Rockefeller. Sir Richard Marchand was definitely one of the entitled, hereditary elite, as they like to think of themselves. His family went all the way back to King John. The American ambassador to Germany, Conan Dietrich, clearly had a lifetime of government contracts steered his way. All he had to do, for the most part, was provide cushy parking spaces for others who were temporarily or permanently disgraced. Commander Kynaston was wondering where General Giamba Campbell fit in. Unbeknownst to ex-President Maurice Lavoisier, there were two other distinguished passengers on the PD (Plasma Drive) Normandy. He did not realize this until he saw them both at the captain's table the first week of his passage. Kahn and Dietrich had been recalled to Washington, D.C., and for unexplained reasons reappointed as ambassador to Mars. It was the quickest confirmation in U.S. history. Malcolm Aldrich III, it was rumored, had made a few calls and made it happen, and now they were together on the Normandy. This was only the third round-trip voyage of the Normandy between Earth and Mars. She was the newest and greatest asset to the fleet of Norwegian luxury liners. Her basic design was similar to that of the plasma drivers for cargo, but built mostly for passengers. The rotating habitat portion of working and living space was greatly expanded. Reactors and engines were scaled up to match the living and recreation spaces. 5 radially placed decks of rooms were distributed in a long tube, centered and spinning about the axis of the ship. The room levels were placed far enough away from the central axis of rotation to give them comparable and comfortable artificial gravity, distributed about 1 g. The H.G. Wells room was one of the prime galley and ballrooms aboard the Normandy. Situated on the outermost deck, it gave some of the best views of surrounding space. The view, of course, was through the ballroom floor and the one transport wall on the end of the structure. The views changed slowly as the cylinder rotated to maintain the illusion of gravity. There were 2 swimming pools with a few racquetball courts on the outer ring of the cylinder, and all of the suites on the outside had transparent flooring in various parts of the living areas. These naturally netted the highest prices. Surprisingly, though every passenger had every possible view available to them through the network of cameras, it was still the actual live view, unaided by technology, that brought a premium. Ex-President Lavoisier was not going to interrupt either one of them at the captain's table. That would look desperate and pathetic. It was a good thing that the Assembly voted for a year's worth of travel vouchers for defeated assemblymen and presidents in that last term, or he would not be here. He already knew he was worth less to them as a defeated candidate. Though French Polynesia did not generally hold great interest to them, he knew that Trevor Van Leeuwan did. French Polynesia was primary stomping grounds for him, so he had hoped to make the best of it. He would postpone his chance meeting until he had something of value to offer. Perhaps once he got to Mars and could start digging again, he would come up with something. He had heard General Campbell had transferred there, so perhaps a reintroduction would prove fruitful. He did not know him very well, but that was to his benefit. They had some common ground, having come from the same part of the world. It was good enough for a starting point. If Trevor's great-uncle, Friedrich Reinhardt, wanted to make his mark on Mars, he certainly did, at Mariner Point. About 3/4 of a mile above the deep of Valles Marineris, and a 1/4 mile from the surface settlements of the frontier, was a large outcropping of rock called Mariner Point. Being one of the more intrepid of the early explorers of the area, Uncle Friedrich liked to climb the walls of the canyon. He basically pioneered rock climbing on Mars, modifying the suits and equipment he used and inventing new aids. He had spent a lot of time up and down the valley, but this point became special to him. He had camped out many times there, absorbing the views at sunrise or sunset. He knew that most people would never get this view without becoming rock climbers, unless he did something to help them along. Standing in the main dining room of the Mariner Point Inn, Trevor still found it difficult to grasp just what a monumental project this had been. All of the materials had to be lifted via cable from the valley floor 3/4 of a mile below, or from the rim over 1/4 of a mile above. It took almost 4 years, but his uncle's determination and drive made it happen. Slowly the hotel, dining rooms, and other facilities took shape. Down below, there were glimmers of this or that piece of glass or steel moved into place. Many of the transparent structural members used in current construction were invented as a means of satisfying his uncle's vision of a nearly perfect view, a view so close to being in the open that there was almost no discernible difference. The Van Leeuwans had their own cliff dwelling not far from here, but much easier to access. Though most lived below, near their work, this was a nice getaway above. They had started an almost generational project to create luxury real estate in the sky. This was done via tunneling inside the valley wall rather than cabling supplies to specific points. Spaces for private residences were carved out of the cliff walls, with living areas exposed to the canyon below, not unlike a high-rise building on Earth, for those living in the completely artificial environments of the lava tubes and tunnels. It was refreshing to see the actual sun in the sky, even if it was in partial vacuum. The Van Leeuwans built more dwellings for themselves or for development purpose, and others copied the effort. Now, in addition to the still magnificent gondolas people took from the valley floor to Mariner Point, there were elevator shafts all the way to the settlements below. There were paths between all of the individual dwellings and to Mariner Point. There were elevators to the surface, both for residents and ongoing construction. There was no real name for this very posh bit of Mars real estate. The people living there had not formed a formal community and referred to the whole area as Mariner Point. Many VLC employees had spent time there, in one of a few company condominiums and at Surface Park. They were given vouchers to stay there as part of the many performance incentives and reward programs instituted by the company. They lovingly referred to it as the Edgar Rice Burroughs. Tonight was the night VLC chose to have one of their impromptu company parties, so they were having it at Mariner Point Inn. Also invited were some of the personnel from Haruta Metals and a few other frontier companies. The governor, the Frontier Council, and others from the government sector as a gesture of goodwill. The party started early, but would go late into the evening. Trevor always wanted as many to see one of those magnificent sunsets as possible, whether they had been here before or not. The Valles Marineris stretched for 3,000 miles and was twice as wide as the Grand Canyon is long in places. It was carved by water billions of years ago and showed many of the layers of her history. The way the sunrise or sunset brought out the various colors of the strata was something he thought everyone should experience. Chapter 27. Who Do You Serve? Van Leeuwan spotted his executive secretary, Roberto, chatting with his counterpart under Ms. Haruta, no doubt exchanging notes on the idiosyncrasies of their respective bosses. Some members of the Philo T. Farnsworth crew were chatting with the governor. Captain Nicolau Quintana and his first officer, Carolina Leike, were among them. Those two were good-natured but firm where they discussed the nature of authority. The governor didn't stand a chance. The governor asked, puzzled, "So there's something I don't understand. Why did you not submit to questioning by the JSO when you were out in the belt? Would that not have avoided a lot of problems?" Nicolau said, "I think the answer to your question lies within it. Why do you use the word submit? Why should anyone automatically submit to anyone else? I had no idea what this Major Son's intentions were in boarding my ship, and I had no prior agreements with him." Carolina took a shot. "So, Governor, how did you become governor? Did everyone in your sector submit to you?" The governor waded in a bit further. "Well, they voted for their council members, and the council members voted for me to be rotating governor." Ms. Leike continued, "So no one actually voted for you directly? And did all of those councilors' constituents vote for them?" Governor Schiari said, "No, of course not. It is the majority who vote for their councilor." Captain Quintana continued, "Did everyone vote in their constituency? What about the people who stayed home? That probably means there was no majority, right? How many took part in the elections?" Schiari was getting more uncomfortable now. "Last time we had almost 50% turnout, CC 50%. Quintana then asked, "So if slightly more than half voted for a councilor, of the slightly less who showed up, then that is roughly 25% support for each counselor, no? I mean, that is far from a majority. What if even more candidates show up? The governor said, well, in that case, it is the person with the most votes, the plurality of the votes. Ms. Leike said, so we could be down to 1/3 of 1/2 or less who show up to vote. That's a long way from a consensus, and that person's vote could decide if you are governor or not. Governor Scharen said, well, that is the system. It cannot be changed. Captain Katana quietly said, on my ship, I am in nearly absolute command. This is because the entire crew made this commitment in full and from the start. I said nearly because I also have bounds to my authority. I cannot force crewmen to do something excessively or unnecessarily dangerous, for example. We all signed on, fully conscious of where the authorities existed. Ms. Leike went on. Governor, I would suggest that you reflect a while on the nature of this system of yours. There's a lot of assumptions and bypasses built into it. Such is this illusion that those in your sector have a choice over who is running their lives. Those JSO goons who abducted us, or you thwarting the inaction of your fellow counselors by declaring a state of emergency. Quintana said, granted, we are all grateful you sliced the Gordian knot for us, but explanation of how we got to that situation leaves a lot to be desired. Many people think we should have cooperated with Major Sun. We had no relationship with the JSO, and the trouble had passed by the time he sought to help us. This was not one of the typical boorish cocktail parties Governor Scharen was expected to attend throughout his career. Perhaps he should have gotten out of his office more over the years. With regard to the Gordian knot, perhaps I did that out of more selfish reasons. If you must know, I was getting more bullying and pressure where I was than anything applied by the new settlements. Trevor had stopped eavesdropping and had moved to this circle. He asked the governor, so what was the reaction of your constituents after you made your announcement? Scharen smiled. Oh, they were very happy. We received many positive messages and are still receiving them. Trevor continued, but you mentioned a lot of bullying. There must be those who are unhappy with you. The governor thought perhaps he might have had too much champagne too early, but offered, well, there was one very unpleasant man who met with me right before I pulled the trigger, as you Americans say. His name is Kynaston, Commander Arthur Kynaston of Space Force UK, I believe. You might say he provided me with inspiration, laughed the governor. Trevor did not let on that he knew who Commander Kynaston was, or that he was also an MI6 man, or that he had had a very revealing conversation with all of them in Berlin. I believe I have heard that name, was all he would say. Well, he seemed to know you and had a very great problem with people like you and your kind, or something to that effect, added the somewhat tipsy governor. Van Leeuwan egged Scharen on. So, did he think we should all be dealt with properly and that you were not up to the job? The governor sobered slightly. I don't really know what he thought, except that people like you and the Mars Council had no business being in charge of anything, and there was something about people needing a stronger, wiser hand to guide them. After the business with your crew, there was no telling what might happen next. Maybe armed troops and tear gas or worse. Cleaning up the mess would cost far more than a few justifiable reparations, and nobody would get hurt or killed. That's why I did what I did. Why make an Olympus Mons out of a Stromboli, eh? Van Leeuwan grabbed another glass of truth elixir from the cocktail tray and handed it to the governor. He was drinking out of reflex now. Trevor's two pilots were standing by, fixated, watching their boss work. So, Fabrizio, you say you have been getting a lot of static from your colleagues or your betters? Are these the people the commander alluded to who should be running the solar system? The governor was catatonic for a few seconds. From every level you can imagine. You would not believe how many backseat drivers I have, laughed Sciarri. Van Leeuwan thought he was about to get more than he bargained for. My betters, you say? My colleagues? Let me tell you something, lo amico, slurred the governor as he propped himself up with Trevor's shoulder. Let me tell you something in private, he said as he waved his pointing finger around at everyone. You remember that nasty virus we had, the tunnel fever, they called it, 5 years ago? No one could forget it. Most of Mars was disrupted for months. A bit too loudly, Governor Sciarri said, I was on the council then, and placed his finger over his lips as a silencing gesture. Week after week we had meetings discussing what to do, how to get supplies, equipment, personnel, what to test for, how to test for it. Did a test even exist? Do you think my esteemed colleagues had any answers? Do you think Earth had any answers? No, se modo. Fabrizio tried to stand up straight while smoothing out his tunic and ceremonial ribbon. If it were not for the new settlements, this entire colony would be set back a generation. You, los amigos, are the ones who did not panic or lose your heads. On the frontier, there was planning. There were supplies and extra equipment and plans for volume production with more and tremendous innovation. The frontier supplied us with the trained people and volunteers, the tools, the masks, the gloves, face shields and temporary hospitals, respirators, defibrillators, or whatever we needed. No, my friend, I had to sit in meetings full of politicians and experts, all afraid to make a decision that might make them look bad, including me. It is easy to hide in that situation, and all kinds of reasons not to help the people you are supposed to help. By the time they had any kind of plan ready, the crisis was already over. There was an awkward silence as the governor looked off into space, slurping some more champagne. No, it is not over for me, my friends. More people are coming who want to fix everything they think is broken. My friend Maurice Lavoisier has invited himself to help me. There is the new ambassador from America and an industrialist, Mr. Aldrich, who wants to sell me military equipment for some such. Though he felt a bit guilty about winding up Sciarri on champagne, Van Leeuwan was getting a wealth of information out of the governor this evening. Conan Dietrich, U.S. ambassador to Mars? Malcolm Aldrich III, coming here? He usually avoided Mars like the plague, regardless of how much money he made there. And then there was Lavoisier, who could never be completely ignored because he knew a lot of people in low places as well as high. Maurice could put all of his time toward any kind of chicanery nowadays and had even more motivation to do it. He sent a note to the concierge to keep an eye on the governor and to reserve a room for him. When it looked like he might pass out, or actually did pass out, to have a couple of stewards take him to his room for a rest. A VLC security man came over and motioned him away from the group. He said his goodbyes and followed. The security man scanned Trevor's viewer, transferring the confidential message to his device. Van Leeuwan found an alcove in one of the corridors where he could peruse the message. Space operations had high confidence they knew the identities of the other 2 plasma drive engines in lunar orbit. There was additional information regarding the happenings northwest of Olympus Mons. One of the plasma drivers they thought to be the Morgenster, owned by a well-known wildcatter and entrepreneur by the name of Bas van Gelder. Van Gelder had been yet another victim of banditry many months ago, and Van Leeuwan kicked himself for not remembering to suggest it to space operations. The 2 Dutchmen were competitors in a way, but perhaps partners in the future. VLC had discovered oil on Mars from which to extract hydrogen, methane, or carbon to make fuel, plastics, batteries, etc. But Van Gelder and his team had been harvesting their own hydrocarbons on Titan for about 5 years now. Some said he was mad, and others said he was a genius, though no one knew just what he was yet. Bas Van Gelder was, in fact, the first victim of an extraterrestrial train robbery known by human beings. His operation on Titan consisted of pumping liquid methane and ethane from the oceans of it that exist there at the surface. Titan itself has mountains of water ice from which to extract oxygen and hydrogen. Nuclear reactors provide all of the energy for oxygen extraction and life support. The surface temperature of Titan is very close to that of liquid oxygen, so storing it is not a problem. For the people working on Titan, really what they need are cold weather survival suits and oxygen. The atmospheric pressure is adequate to work in, and the gas is mostly nitrogen. Gravity on Titan is low, comparable to the moon, so the energy required to launch tankers full of methane, ethane, or liquid oxygen is not so great as on Mars or Earth. The tankers are launched into orbit around Titan until an adequate number are ready for transports to the inner solar system. In orbit, the tankers are connected like cars in a train, only they are in several lines, not just one. When the position of Titan about Jupiter is right to give the train added momentum toward the center of the solar system, then chemical rockets are fired to break out of orbit. The plasma engines accelerate the train further toward their final destination. It was on one of these inward trips just inside the asteroid belt that Van Gelder's train was hijacked and his crew offloaded. There were 2 engines in that train, and both were taken. As soon as Van Gelder's Titan scheme became known, Van Leeuwan wanted to be part of it. Van Gelder knew he was on to something big, however, and kept everything close to the vest. He had put up a lot of money himself, with just a few partners, and he wanted to maintain control. Van Leeuwan could not help but to admire the chutzpah it took to undertake such a venture and to do it on a shoestring. So months ago, when Van Gelder came to him for help, he made sure to lay out the red carpet. Trevor did not know if Van Gelder was in the red or in the black, but he knew that losing those engines and all those tankers was a huge blow to his operation and profit margin. But this was a business opportunity. Van Leeuwan knew the operation would be a winner, and he knew Van Gelder was stubborn enough to make it work. He loaned 2 engines from his own fleet to Van Gelder, along with the small number of tankers VLC could spare. He financed the purchases of new and used tankers to get Titan fuels back to where she was, and maybe a little bit ahead. This he did for a 4% stake in the venture. Van Gelder did not like to lose even 4% of his company he had worked so hard to build, but he was extremely happy to know he could stay in business. Bas Van Gelder was somewhere in transit to Jupiter and Titan, but his brother and business partner, Joost Van Gelder, was here at the party tonight. Everyone who had been dealing with pirates and their losses was invited there in a peremptory celebration, now that so many were in custody. The party was not advertised that way, of course. Of the 2 brothers, it was fortuitous to have Joost there, since he oversaw so much of the shipping and traffic for Titan fuels. Though he hated to disappear from the party, Trevor thought a short conclave with Joost and Fernico would be in order. He sent stewards to find Fernico Haruda, Joost Van Gelder, and James Ka-Okai, and asked them to meet him in conference room 201 back in the hotel. He was waiting for them as they filed in. When they were all seated, he said, "Sorry to interrupt your party, but there were just a couple of things I wanted to cover tonight. I promise we'll be done before the fireworks start. They should be even bigger than the last time." Syncing his viewer to the large screen in the room, He gave the voice command to draw the shades. He doubted if any of the partiers would wander down this hallway, but he did not want to give them a show. Trevor displayed the two plasma drive ships in lunar orbit, one after the other, then side by side. Yost leaned forward in his chair, then quickly bounced up to get closer to the big screen. He touched the screen in various places, asking for magnification. He scrolled each of the images several times, magnifying various portions of them and changing their viewpoints. The answer is yes, yes. These two ships are the Morgenster and the Valk, the ones stolen by those pirates. Look here. You see, for both ships, they have retrofitted some kind of gun turrets, two topside and two below on each. Van Leeuwan made sure not to interrupt. Yes, I see that, and it makes matters even more troublesome. Yost, do you know which pirates took your ships? Were they the same ones who took the Nakamura Maru? Van Gelder looked pissed, as he had a right to be, and said, No, I don't know that they are the same that are in custody. They were never seen because they were in pressure suits and visored up. They jammed all of our broadcast frequencies while they boarded. Then they took control of the ships and their log files. The only message to make it in was a distress signal, which I'm sure the pirates sent as a kind of cosmic joke before they turned off the transponder. They knew no one else had any way of helping us out there. Van Leeuwan turned to his space operations manager and asked, What do you think, James? Is there a way we can positively identify these two ships as the Morgenster and the Valk? Scratching his head, Kaokai said, Well, we all know that the identification etched into the reactor core housing is the ultimate in ship identification. It is repeated on several other key structures in the ship, and sometimes that has been used successfully in disputes. Yost was still fixated on the large display. So where are my engines right now? Trevor could not resist. Hey, 4% of those engines belong to me, Yost. Van Gelder knew he was not being mean and let out a sigh and a phony laugh. The latest is that they are still in orbit about the moon. There has been no change in their status. They are there under some bizarre JSO identification purposely designed to keep everyone in the dark. Kaokai added, There's one bit of added information here. Since we tracked these two drivers here, we have been monitoring their fuel situation. No one has been topping them off, which is unusual for anything under a military designation. That means they are stuck there if they've run out of everything but fuel for attitude adjustment. They cannot break out of orbit right now. Miss Haruta chimed in. Maybe they feel secure somehow. Maybe they do not feel anyone will, as the Americans say, challenge them on their home turf. Still, it seems risky for them not to be able to go at a moment's notice. Van Leeuwan dimmed the viewer and turned up the lights in the conference room. Okay, let's all step back for a bit and take stock of this situation. This piracy problem has been going on for about 8 to 10 years now, but it has really stepped up a notch in the past 3 or 4 years. Who are they targeting? Has there been a shakedown of an Earth-Mars liner? That would be a big score, but a lucrative one, no doubt. So who are the prime targets then? VLC has been hit once successfully, and the second time the operation was thwarted. Haruta Metals has been both victim of piracy and harassment by the JSO. I didn't think you would mind if I let Yost in on that, Ferniko. She said no. I think we can speak about such things plainly here. Yost broke in. We have been shadowed and harassed by the JSO as well. You can probably imagine what we told him to do, he laughed. Then you had this largest heist, which seriously affected your operations, and perhaps your survival as a new company, Trevor finished. Kaokai added, Don't forget Culloden McGregor. I know that he has had people shadowing him off and on Mars for the last few years. He manages to scare them off most of the time with that cannon of his, but has become more of a nuisance for him. Trevor said, I hope that it doesn't come to trading cannon fire, but I would not hold it against anyone who wants to arm themselves. We are very lucky no one has been killed in these raids yet. To get back to the point I was trying to make, just look at who the main targets are again. It is us in this room and others who are doing the exploration and development of Mars and other parts of the solar system. We see the apparent connections between the JSO and the pirates, but we don't have names and motives yet. I have been approached, as has Fernico, about some sort of consortium or takeover of the resources in the solar system. How about you, or Boz Just? Your company is going to be a big player, and you don't have exclusive rights to Titan, but I never thought that it was in your plan. Just said, yes, the politicians and the lobbyists, several of the big Earth defense and governmental contractors, ping us from time to time, trying to get information or to feel us out, as they say. Then there is this legislation they keep talking about, some kind of super annexation of the solar system for all mankind. Van Leeuwan touched the side of his nose and said, You've got it, Just. My feeling is that this whole piracy scare is a tactic to justify some new vote or treaty to cut off future development of resources on Mars and in the solar system at large. They will come in here like some sort of United Nations or U.S. federals to tell us we do not know what we're doing with these resources, and they must be taken away from us as if we were babies. My analogy has been the American Western states, which contain massive amounts of oil, timber, minerals, water, grazing land, etc. Those lands were promised to the people of their states, but were never relinquished by the grabbing hands in Washington, D.C. Fernico said, I understand what Trevor is saying. The same thing happened when Australia, the Sahara, and the Sinai and Arabian peninsulas started to green and bloom. Suddenly, the people who lived there could no longer make decisions about how to take advantage of it. It goes way back to the powers that be, tanking the entire planet's economy every 10 years just to bail themselves out of their bad investments. Then they had the gall to claim they were doing it for everyone's benefit, as they stole the futures of other people's children. Just continued, We've shown that it is the individual and small groups coming together in voluntary mutual ventures, not some top-down, one-size-fits-all plan that truly moves us all ahead. We live this on the frontier every day and help each other for mutual benefit, not at the point of a gun. There must be a way to convince the brain-dead electorate over there that they cannot sit idly by and watch as our rights are trampled. Chapter 28. Marshalling the Troops. Trevor said, Okay, I think we are all in violent agreement on that subject. I just wanted to double-check my thinking with all of you and to focus our attention. We will each branch out to our networks to emphasize the magnitude and imminence of this threat. I believe tightening up our evidence of JSO/government involvement in these crimes must be pursued. It is a major arrow in our quiver for fighting this grand plan of theirs. Ka Okai said, It would help the cause greatly if we could verify the identities of the Morgenster and Volk. I forgot to mention that if we have the radiation signatures, it would greatly add to confirming their identities. Titan Fuels should have those signatures on record. Before we forget, there is the increased and puzzling activity northwest of Olympus Mons, which was why I pinged Mr. Van Leeuwan earlier this evening. Just spoke up. Yes, we have the radiation signatures, and they should be nearly identical for the two vessels. They were commissioned at nearly the same time, and their fuel was from the same lot. Now, what's this about activity near Olympus Mons? Ka Okai said, We had been monitoring the Northern Military Reserve, but were catching activity out in the peripheral vision of some of our satellites. We do have plans for 2 additional satellites in a few months, but for now, we repurposed some to see just what was going on over there. James had the lights down and showed the initial slides that Trevor had already seen of the base and then the happenings farther east. New slides and video showed an increased number of temporary camouflage surface outbuildings near the sinkholes, along with a portable nuclear generator that must have taken a Herculean effort to place out in the middle of nowhere. Slides showed several patches of camouflage netting to match the red Martian dust, but some side shots partially revealed what was underneath. Fernico asked, "What sort of equipment is that under the camouflage?" Ka-Okai said, "It appears to be ranging and tracking gear, radar, LiDAR, long-range scopes, and some other pieces we have not identified. This one here," he said, pointing at the viewer, "appears to be a very sensitive magnetometer." Van Leeuwan broke in. "I believe what we are looking at is a test range of some kind. I wonder if we are looking at a new wonder weapon." "James, what sort of activity are you seeing with regard to those faint blips of light?" Ka-Okai divided the large viewer into 4, and each one played video of a little constellation of faint lights moving at high velocities, engaged in sharp coordinated maneuvers. He continued, "Yes, you see here, we have more and more complex and very military movements. These have been taking place twice each day, morning and evening, for the last week." Sitting back in his chair, Van Leeuwan asked Ka-Okai, "Do you still believe they are vehicles of some type? Possibly drones, as you mentioned before?" James said, "I do. No human being could survive those G-forces, and that would explain the range-finding equipment. That does not mean they are not dangerous, however. We all know how deadly almost any drone can be, and that's why there are such stringent restrictions on their use. For those who abide by restrictions, anyway. Just don't ask me what makes them move, because there's nothing I know of that will do that except photographic trickery." Yost said, "Speaking of abiding by their restrictions, I wonder if their taxpayers know what is going on out there where they said they had no right to be." Van Leeuwan said, "James here believes there could be an underground connection all the way back to the Northern Military Reserve. If that is true, they have been spending a serious amount of money on something never authorized. We all know this is SOP, but their public has to be awakened periodically. I'd say we try to get positive ID on those 2 ships first. Are your original crews available right now, Yost? And would they be in on something like that?" Yost instantly showed a big grin through his big bushy beard, then laughed heartily. "You bet your ass. I'm up for it. And so are those 2 crews. It's just too bad that I'm stuck here on Mars. It doesn't mean I won't be able to join in to whatever degree the time lag allows. The crews are on Earth, but can be at the moon ASAP." Van Leeuwan said, "Good. We have the VLC security teams on the moon, the same ones we used to recover the Haruta Metals engine. I like the idea of adding the original crew members, or some of them, because they know their ships best. They can also spot any modifications made by these intruders. Let's not kid ourselves in all of the excitement, though. If they are JSO personnel on those ships, then we are dealing with trained killers. We can already see the ships themselves are armed. Your crews have to be told all of the dangers before they sign on. The JSO have got to be as nervous as cats in a room full of rocking chairs right now. We do have a few advantages of our own, such as surprise and 2 successful counter-piracy raids under our belt." "More serious now," Yost said. "Trevor, I know this is not all fun and games. It is time to make a statement, though. I agree. Here is the contact information for each of the crew captains. They were due to go on another run, but I will have their schedules changed in case they agree to work with you. I'm not worried about it, though. If you could see how they looked when they showed up without their cargo, you would understand." Trevor replied, "I do understand because I've seen that look myself. Let's get our people in touch over the next couple of days and see what they come up with for a plan. I think we're all done here for now. We don't want to be party poopers, do we? Fernico chimed in. No, we don't, boys. Let's get back to the celebration. The group dispersed and fanned out into the facility. Different music was playing in different rooms of Mariner Point. Food and drink were plentiful. Everyone was having a great time as the sun slowly set. Those who had never seen it before were enthralled, and so were those who had many times before. Few people were able to see it every day without aid of cameras. Even through 2 meters of water and some discreet optical coating, the sunset was spectacular. 2 hours later, the fireworks were let loose from both the Mariner Point outcropping and the canyon rim above, though they were silent. It was a truly technical masterpiece. Seeing the show come off without a hitch, even Van Leeuwan relaxed for the rest of the evening. Standing in the shower in the Van Leeuwan cliff house, Trevor was pondering just how to get close enough to those 2 ships to actually board them and get what they needed. Surely they had some craft on the moon that were faster and more maneuverable than those 2 engines. The plasma engines were not made for fancy moves. They were made for those low but long burning engines and the massive power output of their nuclear power sources. Truth be told, he was worried about those guns. It was clear that the JSO had taken these ships as their own, if they mounted 4 turrets on each one. He stepped out and ran a towel over his hair and dried himself off. There was something niggling at his brain about a Russian Cold War scheme to mount a gun on a satellite. This gun had no turret at all, and the entire spacecraft would have to turn just to aim it. It made him wonder what they were thinking, or did the paranoia just take complete control of them? Dressed, hair combed, and making breakfast, Trevor connected his viewer to the larger one on the wall. Viewer, display Morgenstern and Volk through each of the angles of each of the vessels. As he whipped up some fried eggs on toast, he watched the images go by, nearly burning his eggs in the process. Taking a sip of some strong Santa Barbara coffee, he had an idea. Computer, note each of the turrets. How many types are there? The computer instantly replied, there are 2 types of turret on each vessel. Each vessel has a railgun aft on the top port side and a standard gun forward on the top starboard side. On opposite corners, on opposite sides, are a railgun and a standard gun, such that in each of the 4 directions of plane of the vessel there is 1 of each type. Van Leeuwan then asked the computer, from the images you have, can you tell me what is the maximum elevation each gun can attain above the plane of the deck in terms of angle? Instantly, the computer replied, each railgun is limited to 75 degrees above the deck. Each standard gun is limited to 85 degrees above the deck. After another satisfying swig of coffee, Trevor asked, now, show me the turret angle and rotation limits for avoiding the habitat or other vital areas of the ship. The computer created a 3D cloud in faint yellow about each turret, showing where their fields of fire were without damaging the ship it was mounted to. Darker yellow were the overlapping fields of fire. The rest was a field of blue, where Van Leeuwan's ships or commandos could approach without being fired upon. Oddly enough, the craft were pretty well covered, which he did not expect. These guys were military after all, he mused. He should not get all impressed with himself. At a minimum, they needed to be hit at the exact same time, which would not be easy without detection. Having one of them alert the other was not something they wanted to deal with at the last minute. He needed a few people in different places on the moon to track these guys from the ground. Their attitude in orbit would be critical for both the approach and the attack. Approaching them from the direction least likely to get you shot was probably a good thing. In a final frenzy of creativity, Van Leeuwan pumped out some ideas on how to make the approach ships safer for his teams. Trevor summarized these considerations in a message and sent it off to the moon to his security coordinator in Armstrong City. There would be more considerations and resources to come, but this was all he had to get started. Van Leeuwan knew it was that getting started part that was often the problem for people. Once they got into it, the ideas always flowed. Next, Trevor put through a call to the Mariner Point Inn. He asked the concierge if a suite had been made available for Governor Sciarri and if he stayed there last night. The concierge replied yes to both questions and reported that the governor was alternately nursing his hangover and sleeping. There was nothing to worry about because they were taking good care of him. With that out of the way, he called Ms. Haruda. "Hello, Fernico, this is Trevor. Nothing like hitting the ground running, is there?" He had noticed that she was exceptionally happy at the end of the evening as well. She also had a suite at the Mariner Point Inn rather than make the trip back so late. She was nothing like the governor, however. She was a lady. "Yes, Trevor, what can I do for you? Madam, could you tell me what metal fabricators you have on the moon?" There was a short silence as she got her thoughts together. "Yes, we have fabricators at Armstrong City, Mare Frigoris, Agassiz, Mare Nubium, and Gessner in the Sea of Tranquility. I'll send you the contact information. Is there something they could do for you?" Trevor said, "If your fabricators on the moon are anything like the ones you have on Mars, I'm sure there is much they can do. I need some modifications to some ships, but I need to specify the ships first. I'll find out who is closest to whom, okay?" Fernico, still a little bit sleepy, said, "Okay, Van Leeuwan-san, just let me know. Bye-bye." Trevor decided that things were happening a bit too fast. He was pushing people a bit too hard, once again. He needed to take some time out to clear his head. Today might be a good day to climb up to the rim of the valley. He finished his breakfast and put his dishes in the sterilizer, then went off to go take stock of his climbing equipment. Wearing his suits at 1.4 G most of the time, and Mars at 0.38 G, meant that he was not lacking in strength for the climb. It did not matter, though, because terminal velocity, with little or no atmosphere, might as well be infinity. 3/4 of a mile was a long way down. Strength was great, but he still had to know what he was doing. He had been climbing on Earth quite a lot, so he still had the moves. He left the usual messages telling people where he was going and what time he expected to be back. After getting everything together, pressure suit, backpack, oxygen, helmet, ropes, gloves, and other gear, he headed to the airlock at the side of his house in the sky. He headed up the chimney near the rear of his abode, where he liked to start his way up. Along the way, he found new hand and footholds, maybe even making the trip shorter, though some of the holds were a bit tenuous. After a while, he was sweating inside his suit and breathing hard, despite the low gravity. Climbing on Mars was not the same as on Earth. On Earth, your vision was not impaired like this. He had the suit cameras and could switch to those, but it wasn't the same as looking directly. The chimney opened up wider and went farther into the face of the canyon as he went higher. There were a few outcroppings where he could stop and take in the views, which he never tired of. The computer inside his suit stated the time, and he thought he was doing pretty well. Edging his way up the last 10 meters, he could see a little dust drifting from the go-kart tracks above. But then it was not all dust. Some of it was gravel and rocks falling down, bouncing off his suit, backpack, and helmet. Usually, people were a lot more prudent about getting this close to the edge, where there was no railing. Someone was being a wise ass, and Van Leeuwan was starting to get pissed off. Then a bigger rock hit his helmet, almost knocking him off the wall. He dug his fingers into some cracks to make sure his grip was good as he worked upward the last few meters. Then a larger rock hit the side of the cliff right next to his faceplate. It finally dawned on Trevor that some idiot was actually trying to kill him. He moved sideways to a familiar place where he knew he could move that way, then up faster than he could here. Maybe he would catch him by surprise. He made it upward nearly to the surface when he felt a boot on one hand stomping. He withdrew his hand quickly and stuck his fingers into a crack to hold on. He tried his other hand and got it stomped on. Whoever it was realized he was not going to reach him with his foot and grabbed a rock, dropping it on his head. It bounced between his face shield and the cliff and dropped onto his chest. Wiggling a bit, the rock dropped and bounced down the chute toward the open cliff face and the Valles Marineris below. Through the corner of his eye, he could see a crack in his faceplate. He had plenty of air for a tiny fissure like that, but if it split open, he would be dead in less than a minute. The man or woman above must have been off looking for a bigger rock to finish him off. He was halfway over the edge when the person in the pressure suit came over with a large rock, probably to crush his helmet and kick him over the side. The person walking over had a little too much forward momentum, for when Trevor kicked himself up and over, he tripped the mystery killer, whose legs stopped, but upper body, clutching the rock, kept moving forward. With Trevor striking his or her legs, he or she flipped feet up behind, spinning end over end into the notch in the side of the valley. Desperately, the attempted assassin grabbed at the scree at the bottom of the notch, but kept sliding downward toward the open face. Trevor had put his head up only high enough to catch his attacker disappearing over the side of the canyon toward the valley over a mile below. Next, he heard a loud tick, tick, tick sound of something about to break. He tore open his waist pack for a patch, ripped off the cover for the adhesive, and smacked it against the crack in his face shield, holding it tightly. He could feel the heat from the exothermic reaction of the adhesive, so he knew it was working. It would seal, and the helmet would stay together long enough for him to get inside somewhere. Almost no one was around. There were people way over by the go-karts and some more at the observation deck, which included a railing offset from the very edge. The only sign that anyone had been there at all was a drone and its controller there on the ground. It did not appear to belong to anyone else, so he picked them up as he moved quickly toward the airlocks over by the go-karts. Van Leeuwan was shaking a bit as he made his way inside the airlock. He double and triple checked that the lock had reached one atmosphere, even though there were others going through with him. He was halfway down the elevator before he took off his helmet. Others noticed the smell from the adhesive, and after seeing his faceplate, patted him on the shoulders, saying he was one lucky SOB. He made his way to the concessions and found a table in the back to regain his composure. After having a well-deserved beer, he made his way down through Edgar Rice Burroughs to his family getaway. Once inside, he put the drone and controller down, quickly stripped off his pressure suit, underwear, and flung himself into the shower. Somebody is getting really serious now, Trevor thought. They actually tried to assassinate me. He spent a long time under the water, taking deep breaths, glad to be alive. He had to find out who the person was. This wasn't like Yosemite, where the body would be found in a few hours. Almost no one would be coming by where that person dropped to his or her death. He dried off and dressed again in some of his favorite clothes, then fixed himself a big bacon cheeseburger for lunch. Linking the drone to the big viewer in his kitchen, he commanded that the drone video replay from the start. The video started with what looked like McGregor's big self-contained prospecting rig out in the middle of nowhere. Starting from rather high up, the drone descended to where the rig was getting larger, crawling slowly across the valley towards some alluvial fans. Stopped now. Some large scoops on the front of the rig reached out to grab a good amount of the loose material in the wash of the fan. McGregor was experienced and a damn genius at this work. His rolling laboratory could tell you the relative composition of every element in those scoops of dirt in about 4 hours. It was heated, dissolved, melted, run by this chromatograph or that ion separator, and a report spit out into his database for future reference or for the claims office. It appeared in this case that he might come back to this site. The next day, a robotic arm drove large stakes bearing streaming flags in the area of the ground he sampled. McGregor was filing a claim. The next video was more disturbing. Van Leeuwan was shown at the Mars Frontier Council meeting and speaking. He was also shown at the Pathfinder Ballroom and Mariner Point. Finally, he was there on the side of the canyon, slowly climbing up the side. His would-be killer was using the drone to track his progress up the valley wall. so he or she could meet him at the top to do him in. He wondered, how did this person know he would be here? How did they know it was me? That was easy. His climbing gear had been photographed before at other events. He stuck out like a sore thumb. Someone had called one of his offices, and they let whoever it was know what he was doing. Trevor and his associates had always talked about things like this happening, but experiencing it yourself was a whole different thing. He knew what he had to do. He called his security agency, Frontier Threat Management, asking them to come to his home to start an investigation. He told them also, through their secure communications, about the body at the floor of the Valles Marineris below his condominium. He told them he had handled the drone and controllers, so they made a note of it. They told him to leave his pressure suit where he had taken it off, and they would process it as evidence. The investigators took less than 30 minutes to reach his abode. 2 of them sat with him in his kitchen, while a third collected the evidence he spoke about. He told them who he had called to let them know he would be climbing, just in case. They would be questioned later, they said. They were very stoic, serious people. They were not accusatory, but guided the conversation in order to move the investigation as quickly as possible. Trevor would be notified to see if he could identify the body that had fallen from the cliff. It would be difficult, if not impossible, but he should gear himself up to try. Trevor was frank with the investigators about his likely rubbing several powerful people the wrong way through recent events, and perhaps this was the motive. The investigators did not comment excessively, as was their nature not to influence events. They did say that thus far it did not appear that he had violated any personal codes of conflict based upon his agreements with them and his insurance providers. He had helped to recover stolen property, was all, and worked with others who had made pledges very similar to his for how he acted in the community. If what he said was true, then he had only acted in his own self-defense regarding the rock climbing incident. They told him that he should not say anything more except to his advocate or to them, if he chose. Statements made during or about an investigation could be used against him, so they advised caution. It was stated policy for Frontier Threat Management to not leak tawdry bits to the press. They would, however, make a public announcement regarding the finding of the body. Anyone who knew of a missing person who could possibly identify it should come forward. The body could be recovered for burial after all evidence was gathered. For understandable reasons, Van Leeuwan didn't feel like staying in the condo that evening. He would return to his home/office suites below. Roberto called him and told him he had already spoken to the investigators. He had no recollection of anyone calling in search of him or asking where to find him that day. Trevor knew, of course, Roberto was the epitome of discretion. Trevor told him not to worry, though he was still apprehensive himself, and that he was actually on his way back to the office suites. These people after him really were as nasty as he told everyone they were. When there were problems like this, where he could do nothing but wait, Trevor liked to go back to his engineering roots for workable problems. His head went back to the problem of the assault on the Morgenstern and Volk. Not exactly an engineering problem, as much as a survival problem. What ships did he have available? He had basic starship workhorses for short-haul to orbit-type jobs from Earth primarily. They had fuel to position themselves and maneuver around a heavy but armed plasma engine with almost no fuel. He was thinking of having Haruda's fabricators make him some armor. The problem with armor is that it is so damn heavy if it is to do any good. These old spacecraft designs in the Sol system were never cut out to be flying tanks, as in Panzers. He was back at the office now, and he could really get into it. He thought, let's use the old reliable SpaceX type of starship. There should be some on Mars, but if not, bring them from Earth. Have the fabricators mount a big conical armor plate extending above and away from the top. It should look like a rocket with a conical hat suspended above the nose. Make sure that the fairing will still open and close with the gun retracted. Then mount a good-sized gun axially enough to take out their turrets but not blow up the ship. Place it on a sliding mount inside the payload section of the starship. Mount it so the gun and barrel will slide to the very top or forward end of the rocket. Make a hole in the armor plate a bit larger than the barrel so that the barrel may pass through it and move around in front of the armor. We'll ask the security guys on the moon how thick the plate should be, but we don't want it too thick. The illusion might be enough. We don't know. The point is, we have the smallest possible profile for their guns to fire on if we keep the nose end of the starship pointed at them at all times. A smaller shield means less weight to haul. We also need a couple of doors for boarders to come out of the payload bay through the armor shield and descend on the target. The armor shield won't be a problem on the moon because we don't have to consider aerodynamics. Van Leeuwan wrote all of his ideas up and shot them to Joost van Gelder and Ms. Aruda, along with his security teams on the moon. Chapter 29. Call the Professionals. When Trevor awoke the next morning in more familiar surroundings, he felt a bit more like himself. He felt better until he got the call from the investigator. A badly mangled body in a pressure suit had been recovered approximately where Trevor told them they would find it. They searched for less than 45 minutes. The body was available for possible identification at a morgue in the new settlements. He was given the address and time to be there when the investigator would meet him. Upon arriving at the morgue, Van Leeuwan took a big gulp of air and walked into the cool storage area with the investigator, Mr. Channing. The body was on an examination table, and Trevor was guided to it, where the medical examiner raised the sheet. The body was not in as bad of shape as he thought it might be. The depressurization had done far less damage than the Great Fall had. The suit, by trying to stay rigid, did its job protecting the limbs until it gave out. The helmet protected the head and face well enough for him to identify him. Trevor stood back a bit and asked, "Mr. Channing, could I borrow your sunglasses briefly?" The investigator was a bit confused, but complied. Van Leeuwan opened the stems and hovered the dark glasses in front of the eyes of the corpse as he looked down the length of his arm. "Yes, Mr. Channing, I know who this man was. His name is Francois Levesque." The examiner raised the sheet back over the body. Inspector Channing told him, "I think we are done here." As he raised his recorder in front of Trevor, he asked, "So, Mr. Van Leeuwan, you are making a positive identification today?" Trevor replied, "Yes, sir. I am 95% sure, given the damage to the body, that this person was known as Francois Levesque. He was a close associate of the former president of French Polynesia, Maurice Lavoisier. I have seen them together many times at various public functions." Mr. Channing said, "Thank you, Mr. Van Leeuwan, for your input." End of Van Leeuwan identification session. Channing's notes were always uploaded real-time into the company database, plus an escrow database. People finally got tired of cops and prosecutors altering or making up evidence to suit their own purposes, so the market made that much more difficult. Business owners were also much savvier about their security logs to make sure that possible evidence on their end was not tampered with. Walking out of the morgue, Mr. Channing said, "So, Mr. Van Leeuwan, do you have time to discuss this Mr. Levesque this morning?" "There's a little coffee shop right over there," Trevor said. "Certainly, there's no time like the present." They walked across the pathway to a small shop, which still had their "Do Not Serve" sign, with the listing of non-desirables on display. A young waitress came over to take their orders, and Trevor said, "Could you bring me a double mocha, no whipped cream, please? And I'll have one of those breakfast sandwiches, ham and eggs with cheese on an English muffin." The investigator said, "Just a large coffee, the largest you have, with 2 creams and 2 sugars, thanks." Waiting for the waitress to leave, the investigator continued. Van Leeuwan, interview number 1 on Francois Levesque. "So what do you know of this unfortunate victim of deceleration trauma?" Trevor was playing with the salt and pepper shakers, sliding them from side to side. Taking a deep breath and letting it out, he said, "Francois Levesque and Maurice Lavoisier were almost joined at the hip for years, it seemed. There were all kinds of stories about him, and I never bothered to see which ones were true. Some said he was ex-French Foreign Legion. gone private merc, gone independent contractor. Others said he came up through some European organized crime syndicate, starting in the festering suburbs of Paris, or maybe smuggling through Marseille. When Lavoisier showed up in French Polynesia, Levesque was there with him, though not all the time at first. He floated back and forth between Europe and Polynesia. It always seemed to me that Lavoisier was using Levesque and vice versa for an aggressive climb up the ladder. The waitress brought over their coffee and Trevor's breakfast. Not having eaten breakfast, and thankfully so, with having to make a trip to the morgue, he dug into his sandwich. Mr. Channing had let the recorder run while he was formulating his next question. All right, then. We have rumors about him. What are your personal impressions of him or knowledge about him? Trevor thought for a second as he swallowed some more of his sandwich. I think Lavoisier liked having him by his side to make him look tough. It never really worked on me. But now that I think about it, several people who had or could possibly have made trouble for the president mysteriously disappeared or died in tragic freak accidents. When I was in Berlin for the big conference, I could have sworn that someone was tailing me. It's a big city, though. I thought I was just being paranoid at the time. You know, Lavoisier just lost his office as president. He's not going to be appointed to anything, even ceremonial, in French Polynesia, so he's done there. If Levesque had hoped to hitch his wagon to a star, then that is no longer Lavoisier. I would bet that Levesque had a lot more imagination than his old boss, and probably had several masters at once if he was truly an independent contractor. Or maybe he was as desperate as Lavoisier to get back in the game and picked out a trophy he thought would do that for him. I was told by the governor that his old friend Lavoisier is en route to Mars as we speak, perhaps for that same purpose. Mr. Channing said, I see that you do not have a lot of direct knowledge concerning Mr. Levesque. What you've said is mostly speculation, but that can be useful also. We need to speak with the man's known associates to get his frame of mind, or some passing remarks he might have made. It is not evidence, but it could point to a conspiracy. Van Leeuwan asked, Are you going to announce that you have found and identified a body? Mr. Channing said, Now that we have identification, we will run the DNA against the known databases. If this man had a government clearance, then he should be there under one name or another. We need to make an announcement as soon as we have a positive ID for the next of kin out there. Trevor said, Thanks, I appreciate the heads up on that. Channing replied, Of course, we do not want anyone put in danger. You may not have to go so far as surrounding yourself with private security, but just increase your situational awareness a few notches. That's my advice on that. Van Leeuwan continued, I am surprised that you have not asked me who I thought might want me dead. The investigator replied, Well, we have only just started here. I was going to get to that, but now that you have brought it up yourself, was there something you wish to share with us? The waitress took their dishes away and brought them 2 new large coffees. They changed locations to a booth farther back into the shop. Almost everyone was outside under the artificial sky, rather than under a roof. Having dealt with frontier threat management for decades, he knew these guys were top-notch professionals, unlike their Earth-Moon political counterparts. So Van Leeuwan filled him in on the meeting he had had in Berlin with the veiled threats, the allusions to the possibility of unlimited wealth if he would play along. He enlightened the investigator on the ongoing intrusions and intimidation tactics toward others on the frontier, and similar offers to what he received in Berlin. He indicated that the JSO and more nebulous forces were perhaps combining their efforts in harassment and piracy as a form of intimidation. In Van Leeuwan's mind, these were all relevant factors that could be different elements and motivations for this particular crime in order for someone to commit other crimes. Channing took all of this in personally while his machine recorded. There were no odd looks on his face, no eye-rolling or outward skepticism. Van Leeuwan thought if he looked up the word stoic on his viewer, he could see a picture of Mr. Channing. He took in all of the information, and when Trevor paused, he asked, All right, is that all you have to say on this case for the present? Trevor sat back, laying his head back on the leather booth seat, looking up. He had a bit of a buzz going from the coffee. Yes, sir, I believe that covers it for now. I'm sure plenty of people think they have a good motive, or that they might be protecting the people by taking me out. That's as much as I can say. Channing said, Well, sir, you have given us plenty to chew on for the time being. We will need to get some more associates on this one. It might be our biggest case ever before it is over. The waitress came back with separate checks as they had requested. No one wanted even the hint of bias here. Trevor left a few micro-ingot cards of osmium for the waitress, and Channing did the same. There was no arbitrary authority out here to cut off different avenues of investigation on the grounds that it might embarrass a person or persons politically connected, or reward that person putting up the roadblocks. There were no interlopers swooping in to take over the investigation from some higher level. On the frontier, a crime was a crime, and it did not matter who the perpetrator was. A crime for the average guy on the street was still a crime for someone far more connected. This was the prevailing philosophy. There were no local, regional, or national gatekeepers intermixed with honest investigators to solve real crimes. However, no one had ever tested frontier practices to their limits. Chapter 30. A Plan Comes Together. Van Leeuwan did feel better now that he had given the official investigation a more complete picture, though he was a bit apprehensive about what direction it would go. He was much less worried about being accused of murder. On a personal level, he still felt pretty sick about it, even if it was self-defense. It made him question whether boarding those ships in lunar orbit was still the right thing. It's funny how enthusiastic people can be planning such things without considering negative outcomes. And worse, how reluctant are some to end those plans when disaster is all but assured. He was back in his office, reviewing his messages. He had heard back from Haruda, Van Gelder, and his security team in Armstrong City. He did not have the starships on the moon presently, but several from Earth were available. Van Gelder's crews were still there, so they could come up on his ships. He still needed to come up with the gun, and Earth was the best place to procure one. It was looking again like they would start their mission from the Haruda yards at Armstrong City. But he was getting ahead of himself. The plan was all in his head, not reviewed or even walked through by the rest of the team. Paging back through his messages, Trevor grabbed the one from Sergeant Fisher from the lunar security team. She was enthusiastic about the plan and had some of her own details to add. She went through a number of gun options and settled on a newer rail gun. It was lighter than many older designs, but could accommodate a heavier generator to drive it. The problem with rail guns is that they require a lot of power to fire them. The alternative was the standard gun, whose power was contained in each cartridge. There was a nifty new Gatling gun made by the Israelis she thought would be good for those who did not have much experience. Her recommendation there was to have the computer do the aiming and firing while maintaining attitude control for the spacecraft. There would be considerable recoil. The gun emplacements on the ships, being cantilever mounted over the sides, was a bonus in terms of avoiding damage to the ship directly. Projectiles could pass right through them without danger of penetrating sensitive areas of the ships themselves. He put the information together on the Gatling gun model number, mounting options, controller, and accessories, in with a catch-up message to Megan in Taha'a so she could set her bloodhounds loose. She could tentatively make arrangements to put Van Gelder's crew together with the craft and the machine guns. It wasn't any weirder than any other request he had given her. He sent everyone a message to arrange a meeting in the next 24 to 48 hours to create a final plan for the assault. Early the next morning from their offices in the new settlements, Frontier Threat Management announced the finding of the body below Mariner's Point and identification of the body as one Francois Levesque, lately of French Polynesia, by way of Franco-Germany, Earth. The announcement stated that the body was identified by one eyewitness and through DNA databases. The man in question was being examined as part of one ongoing investigation, but family members were encouraged to contact their offices regarding arrangements. The story did not make much of a splash on Mars, other than with a few of Trevor's close friends, before he gave them the details, who knew that he had been climbing above the vicinity where the body was found. This event was a bit unusual, but the residents of Mars had become somewhat inured to such stories. After over a century and a decent amount of technical progress, they still knew what a very dangerous place this was. Some took a sick delight in schadenfreude with stories such as those about the late Francois Levesque, particularly the news nets for the Earth-Mars liners. Passengers on the PD Normandy were no exception to their cruelty. The closer to Mars, the more Mars stories were put through their channels. Lavoisier had never been to Mars, so there was even more trepidation for him in this whole trip. That was bad enough. Now his part-time sidekick and hatchet man was dead, and he without a clue. For sure, the news nets were never going to get him an answer because they never did. It was an odd, ignominious way for Levesque to go. Lavoisier wondered what he had been involved in. It wasn't anything he'd sent him to do. Levesque had seen Lavoisier's future in the cards long before the election, spending more and more time on other projects. They had a funny arrangement. Each explored side projects, sometimes involving the other, if any panned out to their mutual benefit. He wondered if he would be questioned on arrival. The two most disturbed about the story on the PD Normandy were the president and CEO of Berkeley Arms, Malcolm Aldrich III, and the American ambassador, Conan Dietrich. They were racking their brains if they could be connected to Mr. Levesque. Why be connected to someone so pedestrian? The unflappable Malcolm Aldrich III actually looked like he was sweating. It was a long shot, whether they had anything to worry about. It wasn't like dead bodies had never turned up in their wakes before. After their meeting in Berlin, they wanted to know more about this Trevor Van Leeuwan, see if he had any easy weaknesses. They asked Sir Richard if he could recommend anyone to follow him around for a while. He suggested Francois Levesque. Never having engaged a boots-on-the-ground person directly, they had no idea what they were doing. Regarding uncooperative people in the past, they made a few remarks to key lawyers, and that was it. Here they had acted impetuously in the interest of cost, middlemen, and expediency. Should they let Sir Richard know of their problem, or hope it will go away? Had anyone seen them meet with the Frenchman? Malcolm Aldrich III was worried about who was examining the gunnery on those repossessed ships when he wouldn't have given it a thought before. Van Leeuwan was getting inside his head. After a delayed back and forth with the Earth-Moon teams, they agreed on a plan of attack. Magellan worked miracles and secured delivery of the Gatling guns. Osmium ingots greased the wheels and got them moved to VLC Tripoli, where the flight crews were en route. The crews with the guns would blast off for the moon in 13 hours. Haruda Metals, Sea of Tranquility, was thought to be better for the modifications. Security teams were en route there. Final designs for the armor were finished and fabrication had begun. Mounting the guns and modifying the starships would be the last step. Brief training with the flight crews and assault teams was planned but not guaranteed. Magellan had arranged for VLC security team spotters along the flight path. High-power telescopes on the surface would relay the action if it could possibly aid their brothers in orbit or be useful later. Van Leeuwan, Haruda, and Van Gelder met at the VLC headquarters in the new settlements on D-Day. Everything was in place. Tracks of the target vessels were dialed in to coordinate liftoff from the Haruda Metals yards, and the countdown was running. Though Trevor could have eliminated the communication delay for himself, he opted to wait it out with his compatriots. The two starships had taken off 5 minutes ago to intercept, but they were watching the action as if it were live. There were still over 2 hours to go for an orbital alignment close enough to begin action. Everyone watched as the two craft accelerated away from the Sea of Tranquility, sporting the strange-looking hats above their nose cones. Megan had arranged for ground observers over on both the day and night sides. Each was to determine the attitude of the target vessels and relay it to a controller at VLC Security HQ in Armstrong City. The assault ships needed this information in order to adjust their attitudes for attack. In 25 minutes, the assault ships were in stable, low lunar orbits, lower but not even with the target ships. Industry captains watched as the screen split, showing the interior views of the payload area for each starship. Artificial lighting of the bay interior gave way to the stark white of the surface of the moon as one half of the fairing opened to space. This was in contrast to the black armor plating suspended outside the hulls of both. Red rotating lamps started at the top of each set of Gatling guns. The mounts moved forward as the multiple barrels disappeared through a carve-out in the shield. Computer displays modeling the starships popped up as the degrees of freedom for the barrels were tested. They covered a cone of fire of nearly 1 steradian. Cameras and sighting lasers were mounted with the barrels and on the surface of the shield for the pilots and gunners inside the pressure cabin and bridge. Additional team members would remain in the bay in pressure suits to deal with possible gun jams or ammunition loading. Trevor, Vernico, and Eust were impressed with the engineering going from sketches on a napkin to reality so quickly. Trevor said, "We have 3D scanning lasers to aid our sighting. For defensive and offensive reasons, we want to control the relative attitudes of the attacker and target." With more than 1 hour to go, Van Leeuwan then proceeded to tell them how he was almost killed on his climbing outing and by whom. He told them that investigators may or not be getting in touch with them. All agreed that the stakes were getting considerably higher. They listened as the ground observers sent in their data to the controller. Their 3D scanner data wasn't so accurate at this distance, but it was helpful. The starship computers were digitally tied in with the ground observer data and their own 3D scanners. Attitude control was calculated to keep the dark disk of the armor always facing their target, as well as maintaining the lowest cross-section. They could still be seen on radar, but computers monitored that while ground control relied on transponders. On board the Morgenstern and Valk, it was just another lazy, boring day. Command had put them on ice for the time being, and there was no talk of being relieved. The Descartes was closing on the Morgenstern, while the Huygens had the Valk in sight. Neither target was aware of any threat. Sergeant Fisher, aboard the Descartes, watched as their gun sights moved over the target. As the attitude control thrusters had stopped and the rear turret was in the center of the sight, she yelled, "Fire!" to her gunner, and over the comms to the Huygens, tracers raced across the expanse, smashing into the rear turrets of each of the ships. The crews of the Morgenstern and Valk felt their vessels shake wildly as they absorbed the momentum of armor-piercing bullets. The attackers raked back and forth a few times before the order, "Cease fire, target second turret." Both the Descartes and the Huygens targeted the second topside turret as planned. Fisher once again yelled, "Fire!" over the comms. Video from the ground observers saw chunks of the turrets spinning off into space and electrical lines sparking. The Morgenstern was also rotating. The Huygens had moved up on the Valk, even as she was firing. This had been a last-minute change by the leader of their security team, Sergeant Akai. He wanted to get in tight as a clenching move. He and his team poised in the cargo bay, ready to go through the shield on his order. The Morgenstern was using the momentum of the second turret strike and her attitude thrusters to rotate her 90 degrees. The Descartes struggled to maintain the same view of the Morgenstern in front of her, but the maneuver was too slow compared to a simple twist. The Morgenstern was bringing her other set of guns to bear on the Descartes in a broadside. The Descartes' guns were still focused on the railgun in the rear, or where would be when the ship turned over. Most of her was behind the shield, but not all. When both the cannon and railgun had a shot at the Descartes, they fired. The Descartes fired at nearly the same time, hitting the railgun mount repeatedly. A deadly railgun projectile from the Morgenstern flew past at thousands of miles per hour into space. The cannon projectile smashed into the edge of the shield, but the thrusters of the Descartes maintained a lock on the Morgenstern. The gun had been programmed to take aim on the second turret ASAP after scoring the other hit. The last turret was taken out in a blaze of Gatling gunfire and tracers. Sergeant Akai looked at his rangefinder and gave the order to open the shield doors on either side of the gun. He took one side and his second took the other. Both fired their bolts into the Valk outer decking, with the boarding cable streaming out behind. With the cables tied to the Huygens, his men quickly streamed over to the Valk with their equipment for boarding. By now, both target ship crews were scrambling for defensive positions inside. Once the two teams had boarded, they disconnected the cables. Sergeant Akai didn't know what these guys considered battle stations, but he figured the rear reactor area, as did Fisher before. He was going in at 2 points there and 2 points through the habitat. He placed charges on the outside plating of the rear corridors of the reactor. Simultaneously, holes were blown through the plating about 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Tracer fire came from one of the holes, but nothing from the other. His second jammed a fiber optic viewer into that hole as he threw a flashbang into his. He knew there wouldn't be much of a bang, but maybe the flash would be enough. His opposite started enlarging the hole to get his men through. Another team had already moved to the rotating habitat. Sergeant Akai cut out about half the hole when more tracer fire erupted. He knew there were at most 3 people down there, and he tossed in a couple more flashbangs before he resumed cutting. There was no bang, but the flash should disorient them somewhat. By this time, the team from the other side had moved around with 2 of the bad guys tackled and zip-tied, their exit blocked. When Akai popped through the hole, the last man knew he was not going anywhere and raised his arms. His men were already sealing the holes in the hull plating from the inside. 2 others elected to stay outside, where they slowly made their way to the 2 remaining turrets opposite, traveling the distance on this side. As they moved, they hooked automated safety lines to the hull where possible. Once they ran the lines out, they remotely opened the hooks behind them to reel in the lines. As each reached their target, they were conveniently looking at the underside of their respective turret assemblies. Both placed a couple of shaped charges to where they might do the most damage. Scrambling back toward the center and clipping onto the hull, they waited for the fireworks. Van Leeuwan et al. Were treated to a fantastic shower of sparks as they viewed the show relayed via the Huygens cameras. The sappers then moved to join their fellows infiltrating the habitat. The plan was to only board these 2 ships to get the ID verification showing they were property of Titan Fuels. Sergeant Akai had other ideas which might get him into big trouble, but he wasn't thinking that far ahead. Maybe it had something to do with those big kids hijacking his sailboat when he was 10 years old in Kauai. The crew members of the Valk told him they could get in through certain airlocks because they had programmed in bypass codes. The plan was to enter at opposite airlocks, split, and fan out both directions through the habitat to sync up with whoever was left. 4 of the security men and 6 crewmen grabbed onto the rungs of the habitat close to the airlock as it passed. The others waited for it to rotate another 180 degrees before they jumped on. The crewmen punched in the codes on both sides on cue and pushed into the airlocks. Quickly, they shut the outer door and punched in the override code. The airlock quickly came up to pressure, but no one removed their suits. Pushing through, they dove toward the floor to avoid any possible fire. Nobody was waiting on Sergeant Akai's side of the habitat, so they fanned out. On the other side, there was a brief exchange of gunfire, but the 3 or 4 on the JSO team were lightly armed and gave up. No one was injured other than a few scrapes. The rest were cornered in the interior control center, where they were calling outside for help. Their cry was cut off by the command center being overridden from auxiliary control in front of the reactors. The JSO was a long way from doing anything about it, as were any other lunar authorities. The word was out, though. The geekier types on the moon, who liked to watch and track orbiting vehicles, had seen the explosions from the attack. The ones with even better telescopes were watching men on the outside of the spacecraft. Others had heard the open channel distress calls, but it was done. The Valk was now in the hands of her original crew and the VLC security team. Sergeant Fisher was in contact with Sergeant Okai's team, who she good-naturedly chastised as being a show-off. "I don't suppose you called a fuel truck so you can just fly that thing out of here, did you, Sergeant?" The reply came quickly now. Yeah, actually I did," he said. This got her thinking as well. "Did you order enough for 2 of these bad boys?" Okai told the ground controllers who to contact to find out, then told Fisher that the Valk had been taken. She asked her crew about codes for the auxiliary control room and how to override. Since the ship had been stolen, the backdoor password still had highest priority, unless they did a hell of a refurbishment. Okai said, "Sergeant Fisher, I believe we can accommodate you on that fuel, but us first," he laughed. Her team had secured the reactors and captured 4 crewmen. 2 of Van Gelder's original crewmen were in Morgenster's auxiliary control and in charge of the ship. Van Leeuwan, Haruda, and Van Gelder were both upset and excited by the teams exceeding their orders. Though the worst was over by the delay, they were on the edges of their chairs. They didn't know what was coming next, but they had a good idea. It was only a few minutes before they heard the call of VLC TT-0131 coming to service the Valk. They were directed to proceed topping off for fuel and oxygen. Those remaining of Van Gelder's Titan Fuels crews were with the tender, sad they missed all the action. The JSO crew from the Valk was gathered together in their matching zip ties. Those on the Morgenster were still at large in the habitat. Sergeant Fisher addressed both groups through the comms link. "After questioning several of you, we don't believe that you musclehead order takers really understood what you were doing here. We'll even overlook several of you taking shots at us. We hope you understand we are here to retrieve stolen property, namely the Morgenster and the Valk. Those are the vessels you've been squatting in for some time. We'll leave your commanding officers documentary proof. Now, we're leaving you with a choice. Number 1, you can fulfill whatever twisted duty you feel you need to perform and be tried as pirates. Or number 2, we can drop you off at a safe, undisclosed location to find your own way. By the way, for those of you on the Morgenster, we could fly her on automatic, so if you don't want to be stuck with dehydrated rations on a long space trip, you can surrender now. How many are for number 1? No one raised their hands. Number 2? Everyone raised them. Descartes and Huygens had already retracted their guns and closed their fairings. Both the Valk and Morgenster were fully fueled for breaking orbit with crews aboard, running pre-flight checks. The starships moved down range a bit and jettisoned their shields. They had already picked out the next convenient landing spot on the moon. The plasma engines had to wait for their precise place in lunar orbit in order to break away towards Mars or Earth, which way depended on where the JSO pursuit craft were, whether they could make either. Refueling takes time, and the pursuit ships took advantage of it, adjusting their orbits for taking off directly from the surface. With the pursuers only 8 minutes behind them in orbit, the 2 plasma engines launched into a trajectory for Mars. When Van Leeuwan and Haruda looked over at Joost Van Gelder, they could have sworn there were tears in the gruff old Dutchman's eyes. In less than an hour, news nets were full of videos showing a pirate raid in lunar orbit, Never mind. There was no way to know what happened from selectively edited ground-based amateur coverage. That didn't stop government spin machines from ramping up full throttle. Politicians lamented their heroes had been attacked for no reason. The distress call was played for hours on end. More discerning people went through every second of every video angle from the ground over a longer timeline. They asked, yes, they fired first, but why would fragile, lightly armed, and armored craft go after those targets? The next day, alternative media were given the location in Armstrong City where the JSO crews could be found. Maybe 4 of them were over the age of 19. None of them had anything bad to say about their abductors. One kid said he would be pissed off too if he saw strangers cruising around in his ride. Gag orders were placed on all of them, and they were shipped off to remote assignments. Alternative media were provided with video of the crews after they were captured, being fed and cared for by the pirates. Aside from their officers, they were laughing and joking, and none seemed under duress. Ship's ID numbers were supplied to the same media, which was widely distributed but never commented on by any government spokesman. The PD Normandy was nearing the completion of her journey. The entire ship, like almost everywhere else in the solar system, was abuzz of the pirate attack. Not much got people talking these days, as this had. Everyone had his own theory. The only thing as big was the upcoming trial on Mars. There was no unanimity among the defendants. 5 of them had already pled no contest, but the rest were taking their chances. And now Ambassador Dietrich and Malcolm Aldrich III were watching 2 more ships being reclaimed in their own backyard. Especially galling were the commentators describing munitions from Berkeley Arms being taken apart by this impression of Don Quixote. From Earth, Moon, to Mars, to Jupiter, Trevor Van Leeuwan was some kind of new Robin Hood, stealing from the unscrupulous and giving back to the people who worked for it in the first place. It was unconscionable. Malcolm was beginning to think Commander Kynaston and his boss Sir Richard were right. It was time for a stinging blow to make people remember who their superiors really were. The whole idea behind stealing those vessels in the first place was to advance their schedule and raise the fear level. Now it was all unraveling. Chapter 31. No Room at the Inn. The Mars frontier was definitely making the connection between government cabal and attacks on their livelihood. But that was what governments were, just small groups of men and women forcing you to pay them. Spontaneously, the signs went back up in the windows in the new settlements. Government minions were increasingly being refused service. Cars were not being detailed, laundry was not getting done, and repairs were not being made. Surprisingly, the shops in the government sector were joining in, and not just on Mars, but in various enclaves about the Earth, Moon, and Mars. In those establishments, tips were collected in ingots or Bank of Copernicus notes. French Polynesia was a noted center for non-compliance. There was nothing anyone could do. Government employees were not a protected class, not everywhere. 2 days later, the PD Normandy was in orbit over Mars. She had arrived. Ex-President Lavoisier ran into Ambassador Dietrich and Malcolm Aldrich III only as they boarded the shuttle to the surface in Millikan Center. The meeting was cordial, though, as Lavoisier had guessed, he had fallen a few notches in the pecking order, and he was treated as such. Letting their snobbish attitude go, he pressed on. I suggest that you and I meet on the ground once we are settled, he said to them. Oh, really? Now why is that? Asked Aldrich. I have some information I'm sure will interest you and your future plans. Dietrich was not in the best control of himself after their computer-controlled fall through the thin atmosphere. Of course we'll meet you. We're staying at the Bradbury in the new settlements. Ambassador, I'm afraid they won't let you stay there. Mr. Aldrich, yes, but not you, Lavoisier informed him. What do you mean, won't let me? I'm the ambassador from the United States, barked Dietrich. I'm afraid he's right, Conan. They won't serve your type there. You'll have to stay in the NASA dormitories, Aldrich chuckled. I'm sorry, Ambassador, but I'm afraid you don't understand the mood toward government employees on the frontier, said Lavoisier. Dietrich shouted, I'm not a government employee. I'm the goddamned American ambassador. Malcolm Aldrich III looked at Dietrich and said, Conan, just look to see who signs your paycheck. I mean your official paycheck. Lavoisier jumped in. Messieurs, s'il vous plaît, I may have a remedy. I will be staying with my friend, Governor Schiari, in his official residence. I'm sure that he can accommodate all of us, no? When the ambassador, the CEO, and the ex-president arrived at Governor Schiari's mansion, Fabrizio had all but forgotten about his old friend Lavoisier inviting himself to stay. Now he had two other guests in tow. All of the best hotels where dignitaries stayed were on the frontier. Now, the Hotel Bradbury was suddenly undergoing renovation. It could not take the new U.S. ambassador to Mars or Malcolm Aldrich III. Since Earth governments thought so little of Mars, there were no such things as embassies, only consulates with no guest quarters. The three showed up extremely disheveled, but were welcomed by the residence staff. By the time the governor returned home, Malcolm Aldrich III and Conan Dietrich were drinking his brandy, smoking his cigars, and playing nine-ball. Walking into his spacious study, Governor Schiari said, with undisguised crankiness, Gentlemen, please make yourselves at home. Lavoisier was there, but did not look nearly as comfortable. Lavoisier jumped up, half hugging and shaking his hand. Fabrizio, my friend, it is so good to see you. I hope you do not mind. I brought some additional guests. In the current situation, you know how impossible it is for decent lodgings. He replied, Yes, I just hope you all came in the rear entrance. You could see the picket marchers out there. No one bothered to tell him that the limousine came straight in the front entrance, American flag displayed prominently. Gentlemen, my name is Fabrizio Schiari. I am the current governor of this international sector, said Schiari, as he met the others and shook their hands. This is Mr. Malcolm Aldrich III, CEO of Berkeley Arms, and I am Conan Dietrich, new U.S. ambassador to Mars, Dietrich said. Schiari said, Please relax, enjoy yourselves. Dinner will be at 8 p.m. No one else will be joining us. I must go upstairs to perform a few more duties and get ready for dinner. When he came down for dinner, Schiari seemed less flustered. He seemed a bit friendlier. Seated in the smaller dining room, Schiari asked, So, gentlemen, I know why my friend Lavoisier is here. May I ask what your business on Mars could be? I'm amazed at this new interest which requires a full-fledged ambassador. And you, Mr. Aldrich, we know that Mars is the god of war, but are you here to arm the Red Planet? Conan tried his diplomatic best. Governor, my mission here is to help calm nerves and to alleviate some of the negative feelings we are sensing on the frontier. Malcolm jumped in. I am here not to sell arms, far from it. Having worked so closely with government while running a very private company, I felt I may be able to offer advice to those who are willing to take it seriously. Dietrich jumped in again. Governor, your gesture to de-escalate the situation was a stroke of genius, I must say. I commend your actions. Governor Schiari felt his bullshit detector going into the red. Being a politician himself, he could recognize all of the right words. Gentlemen, we know that time is the best medicine for these situations. We must all keep our heads. After a couple of glasses of wine, Lavoisier decided it was time. Gentlemen, this may or may not be news to you, but a Commander Kynaston of Space Force UK was arrested in the new settlements late yesterday on conspiracy charges. This will kick it up a notch, as the Americans say. The governor perked up a bit. Commander Kynaston? Yes, he is a nasty little man who thought he could tell me how to do my job. I thought I had heard the last of him. I will say a prayer. They take justice seriously over there. The ambassador shot back. This is absurd. They can't arrest a fine patriot like Commander Kynaston. They have no jurisdiction. Calmly, the governor asked, "Perhaps you are right, Ambassador Dietrich, but what jurisdiction allowed the abduction of the Farnsworth crew?" Colonel Dietrich sat back in his chair, taking another sip of the fine Italian wine Lavoisier brought for his friend. "Why, the government has jurisdiction, of course." Sciarri shook his head. "Come now, Ambassador, which government are you talking about? I know of no government that has jurisdiction on the frontier. They have their own way of dealing with antisocial behavior. Do you know anything about Mars? If you are going to be ambassador, you need to brush up on your history. If you like, I could show you the contracts we have with their security agencies." Aldrich said, "It's true, Colin. They have actual contracts and they abide by them. They don't just make up rules, then decide whether or not they want to enforce them like we do. Over there, anyone can prosecute anyone, provided they have a decent case. If the prosecutors or arbiters start to look biased either way, they are likely to go under. They might even have warrants out for you and me." Sciarri was taken aback by that statement, but did not show it. "The contracts provide for limited extradition for the worst offenders, but truthfully, they honor it far better than we do. Constantly, I get interference from the governing council." Lavoisier asked, "Could the detainees be cooperating with the prosecutors? Out of all those defendants, there's bound to be a few who would try to get a better deal." This is exactly what Aldrich had been thinking. Several of the detainees had refused the lawyers he had sent to speak with them. He had no insiders at Frontier Threat Management or Viking Plaza, and there was no way to bug their conversations. Perhaps there was a way to get at them through other prisoners. These folks were all hardcore ex-military or ex-cops. He never thought they'd crack. Kynaston was a fanatic, but Aldrich was even worried about him. The next morning, Ambassador Dietrich came downstairs to find Lavoisier sitting by himself in the breakfast nook, inhaling Sciarri's espresso and fidgeting. He was glued to the kitchen viewer with reporters going on about the body found recently below Mariner's Point. They were reviewing the dead man's association with the former president of French Polynesia and just what the relationship may have entailed. "Can you believe the lies they tell on the news nets?" pleaded Lavoisier. "I know, Maurice, I know. I have been dealing with it ever since I became an ambassador, and before, at my confirmation hearings. So what if I aced out a few competitors for government contracts, or some of their people met with unfortunate accidents? That's just the way life happens." Malcolm was not far behind and smiled to himself. He could not believe how naive or purposely delusional Colonel Dietrich could be after all these years. Had he truly drunk the Kool-Aid? It was difficult to tell. He said, "Gentlemen, shall we have some breakfast?" as he waved in the governor's cook. In a good mood, he felt his best strategy was to throw as much fuel as he could on this fire lit by Lavoisier and Levesque. The question was, could Maurice take the heat? Commander Kynaston was represented by Navy Legal Services. Malcolm Aldrich III was petitioning Sir Richard Marchand to add one of his people, or preferably to replace the Royal Navy lawyer. He couldn't chance Kynaston rolling on any of them. He asked if Sir Richard knew of Levesque's mysterious death. Frontier Threat Management had been asking the New Settlements communities if Levesque had appeared on any of their security video. No friends or next of kin had come forward, and they were trying to learn more about his movements. The reply from Sir Richard came swiftly. He knew about Kynaston because the commander was his man. He had made arrangements for the right man from Navy Legal Services to take his case, so not to worry. What he should worry about was Levesque. Did he hire him through at least 2 cutouts, as he was told, or did he go off half-cocked and engage him directly? And what for? Could anyone implicate them other than Lavoisier? And what was he doing about the other defendants in this case? He wanted to know who they were talking to and what about. 3 days later, the Royal Navy lawyer and 2 more that Aldrich hired were in custody at Viking Plaza on attempted bribery charges. Another of Malcolm's hand-picked lawyers was under arrest for trying to smuggle communication devices. Frontier Threat Management released their names and photos so they could arrange for representation and family visits. Prisons from the Earth to the Moon were filled with the howling laughter of inmates. Bar associations on Earth and Moon were apoplectic that their brethren could be sullied by a holding cell. Trevor wondered what the investigation had pieced together so far, but knew they could not say. He was trying to catch up with work after so many extracurricular activities. The VLC refinery and processing stations were close to operational. They could start trucking product back to the new settlements in another 3 weeks. Chapter 32. The Smoking Gun. Trevor called Director Okai at the Space Operations Center. He wanted to know if he had a plan for close surveillance of the new military playground northwest of Olympus Mons. James told him everything was ready to go. They had the same curiosity he did and had picked out a collection of drones to infiltrate the site from their best estimates of what they would find. Van Leeuwan told him to launch when ready and let him know of any developments. He wondered if there was some smoking gun out west that would aid the cause at all. The pirates were caught red-handed, but what about those who put them up to it? There was open talk in the media now regarding annexation and man's destiny in the stars. How could humans move forward without law and order? The resources of the solar system needed to be preserved and controlled by those with the expertise to make those decisions. This was not for an ungovernable rabble to decide. On and on it went. These people can barely manage to dress themselves in the morning, Trevor scorned. How are they going to be masters of the universe? He thought. They can vote for any damn thing they want, but that doesn't make it valid. Some of the defendants opted for separate trials, and so far 5 pled nolo contendere. Those 5 were sentenced to 4 years hard labor. After being in the lockup, they learned a little about frontier law. The hard labor wasn't exactly the same as on Earth, where inmates were simply exploited. Hard labor on the frontier meant working on a crew, building out lava tubes, or tunneling. It could mean working for a VLC as a roughneck or Haruta Metals, welding or loading. The arbiters tried their best to get some restitution for the victims and add to the skills of the inmates. Inmates had gone on to create their own businesses in the new settlements, largely because they were still wanted on Earth or the Moon, because their antisocial behavior was cured, or both. The remaining guys and gals being held for piracy likely thought they were still connected. Commander Kynaston was not having a good time in stir. Already his lawyer had been locked up, and he wondered who they would send next. He had learned that sentences were not necessarily made harsher if one fought the charges, but could be made more lenient for testimony against a conspirator or bigger fish. He wondered which of his hand-picked men and women were flipping on him now. That business with the lawyers made the detectives suspicious. There were others above giving orders. No doubt they were checking his connections with fellow detainees and more. What were his Dartmouth classmates thinking? He sent messages to Sir Richard, but there were no replies. For plausible deniability, of course. This op was as black as it could be until now. It did not matter. Sir Richard Marchand was Kynaston's commanding officer, so some of the mud would stick, knighthood or no knighthood. Here he was again, waiting in an interrogation room for the detectives. They were always so goddamn polite, which irritated him even more. Detective Connor got right down to business, asking questions about Kynaston's duties, which he flatly refused to answer on the grounds they were highly classified. The detectives showed no expression of approval or disapproval. Next, Connor lowered the lights in the room and punched some keys, bringing up the large viewer. Kynaston saw himself on the screen, larger than life, giving a pep talk reminiscent of a high school football coach to one of the pirate crews. The nameplate of the Nakamura Maru was partially covered with one version of Jolly Roger flag. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, we are not in this business for the booty, though the ships we take will greatly improve and accelerate our mission. The prospectors and miners out there are tough. They can be damaged, but not intimidated. Our orders are to ratchet up the fear for those back home sitting on their sofas. Detective Connor stopped the video. So, Commander Kynaston, would you care to go into more detail on this speech? We have partial logs from 3 recovered vessels. Exchanges aboard them implicate you and a number of alleged pirates, as well as people above you giving orders and intelligence. Do you care to comment on that? Around here, we call that conspiracy, plus aiding and abetting. The commander, with no answers, asked to be returned to his cell. Van Leeuwan was getting a flood of data now from the drones infiltrating the JSO facility northwest of Olympus Mons. As promised, VLC Space Operations Center had drones of all types, some inside the habitable areas and others deeper into the complex. As he suspected, there were entrances through the sinkholes and via burrow or tunnel. The connections went all the way back to the Northern Military Reserve. Access was ample enough to move sizable equipment, such as service vehicles for spacecraft and tunnel boring rigs. His people had estimated at least 200 personnel at the newer site. The drones were busy mapping and measuring everything they could get to. Already, VLC had an impressive computer model of the facility, and none of their drones had been detected. The drones were camouflaged well and moved as much as possible behind and between other objects. This masked them from visual, infrared, and motion sensors, should they be present. They even hitchhiked on people, vehicles, or movable equipment to avoid detection. There were assay and scientific laboratories, machine shops, office or design areas, and what looked like large underground hangars containing several familiar and unfamiliar vehicles. Van Leeuwan figured they had been working on this for several years. The bugs were having limited success thus far in hacking the JSO systems. Being artificially intelligent, they anticipated the routines of the personnel, then managed to hitchhike or move in and out of the contained areas. In this fashion, they could shuttle data to their brothers outside, who would relay it back to VLC. Odd encrypted transmissions were sometimes detected by JSO monitors, but they never originated from the same place twice. There was nothing more predictable than engineering meetings. They happened whether any advances had been made or not. The VLC flies on the wall could not hack into the meeting logs yet, but they could observe, record, and repeat. Video from the drones showed the large viewers in nice detail after moving a few times to eliminate glare. 2 specific sets of meetings Trevor had locked onto were engineering development meetings and military strategy reviews. Some formulas displayed in a conference room looked familiar to Trevor, so he watched this and some related videos in their entirety. As he suspected, the wrong people were coming up with the right science. It was only a matter of time. Though he spotted several glaring errors, there was no mistaking that these were anti-gravity calculations. Video from tests done on models showed they were clearly utilizing what they had learned. They were stuck on several problems in that 1, they could not sustain their fields. 2, the fields were quite weak considering the lift to weight ratios they would need. And 3, the materials they were using could not take the stresses required. Needless to say, the technology was impressive and could not be ignored, given that it was being developed in such an antisocial environment. This was a long-term problem. In the short term, it appeared a substantial bit of military kit had been assembled both at this Camp X and at the Northern Military Reserve. There were many more missile-equipped APCs, rooms full of tear gas and grenade launchers, automatic weapons, body armor, etc., for at least 1,000 men, and still cataloging. How many soldiers were already here on Mars? The answer to that was imperative. The new ambassador to Mars was really stirring things up, warning about vigilantism and chaos that was taking hold on Mars and throughout the solar system. At the same time, Governor Scharen was trying to calm everyone down. The government sector was still under his state of emergency. Rapidly scanning through the military briefing, Van Leeuwan caught it. There was Sir Richard Marchand on the viewer, giving a brief synopsis of the plan put forward from Earth. Upon the signing of legislation and treaty annexing the solar system, troops were to move in to the frontier and the new settlements. They were to take hold of VLC drill site number 1, refinery and processors, Titan fuel depots, and nuclear reactor co-op, and other vital facilities. He said the residents there would not take kindly to the enforcement of eminent domain. Most of them had sidearms or rifles and might resist. They were to be treated as terrorists if they opposed occupation. And we especially need you to break out Commander Kynaston and our crews from Viking Plaza. I know you have all worked closely with this stout patriot for many months, and at the same time he pulled double duty with your brothers and contractors. Brief messages were played from the President of the United States, the Prime Ministers of Great Britain, Canada, and Australia, the Chinese Premier, and several others, stating their wholehearted backing. All of the order takers in the room nodded and shouted, "Yes, sir," in unison, save one, General Jamba Campbell. Van Leeuwan was thinking, this is really going to swell the case files over at Frontier Threat Management. That's a lot of people for a conspiracy case. Now was the time to call an emergency meeting of the Mars Frontier Council. He buttoned up some of the most damning files and sent them via high-priority channel to his security agency and the other attendees. A lot of people had a lot at stake, and they would need to pool their resources, security, insurance firms, and personal, where willing. Chapter 33. The Opening Salvo. By the time the pirates' trial was due to begin, another 6 defendants changed their pleas to nolo contendere and received their sentences. Surprisingly, Commander Arthur Kynaston was still hanging in there with a new Royal Navy lawyer. The lead prosecutor, Don Gallagher, and her team from Eris Associates of Leibniz, retained by VLC, Haruta Metals, Titan Fuels, and individually by the crew members who were also victimized. She had a superb reputation, was educated at an excellent private university on Earth, with law school in the new settlements. This, though, was by far the biggest case she had ever tried. The arbiter was Heinrich Becker, a well-respected partner at Cydonia Decisions, Inc. Jury selection was created from a pool chosen by Shima Deliberations. Lawyers for the defendants were apprehensive about arbitration and the whole scene, but this was the only path forward for their clients. They were given no guidance from their paymasters. The trial, as all trials on the frontier, would be live streamed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Miss Gallagher, "I am here representing the crew members and owners of 6 vessels who have been victims of piracy, assault, battery, kidnapping, criminal endangerment, and conspiracy. The craft in question are the Nakamura Maru, the Kananobu Maru, Volk, Morgenster, Nome, Klondike, and the Philo T. Farnsworth. Many of us are no strangers to space travel, but many of us take it for granted that when we board, say, the PD Normandy, we have very little to worry about. Imagine you are working in the outer reaches of the solar system with only your vessel to keep you alive. We ask that you picture yourself suddenly surrounded by heavily armed craft appearing in the inky blackness. A voice in your comms link telling you to surrender your ship and its cargo. A strange craft is docked with yours, and faceless armed strangers pour aboard the craft, which is both your home and your livelihood. Picture the terror of being set adrift in nothing but life pods, hoping that someone will hear your distress beacon and pluck you from the void. Or you wake up in a shed somewhere with a bag over your head, your hands and feet tied. What if you were an entrepreneur working so far out on the edge that few banks or insurance companies will support your venture, or do it only at great cost? You are running on a shoestring with money borrowed from only those closest to you, who trust you and believe in your vision. You desperately don't want to let them or yourself down. What happens when a very large, valuable cargo, along with significant capital equipment, is lost to heartless thieves? Think of the terror your family members and friends endure as they are told contact has been lost with your ship. What if your stolen vessel was not only part of your business, but had deep personal meaning to you? We will prove that the defendants you see here in the courtroom today were active and enthusiastic participants in these crimes. We will show that their piracy was meticulously planned and supported by quasi-state actors who remain unindicted co-conspirators. We will demonstrate that this brutish antisocial behavior was engaged in by the defendants without remorse or pity for their victims, but only for their mercenary paychecks. Some were not as concerned with the money as by their Pavlovian desire to please their masters. I am sure that if you follow your case carefully and with an open mind, you will grant justice to these aggrieved victims. Thank you. The lead prosecutor returned to her table. It appeared that even the Navy lawyer and the lead defense counsel were impressed by her statement, but couldn't show it. For the defense team, the leading attorney was another one of Malcolm Aldrich III's picks. He chose Stephen Linford Biddle II, Harvard undergrad, Antonin Scalia Law School, clerked for the Supreme Court Justice Alphonse Dimitri, former U.S. federal prosecutor and a leading partner of Biddle, and Lawson in Washington, D.C. He had already made more than one motion challenging the jurisdiction of the court, but was shot down on each one. Another motion to change venue and move to a courtroom he was more familiar with and could manipulate was also shot down. He was not a happy camper, but stood up and faced the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good day to you, he began slowly. I stand here before you representing not pirates, as the prosecution might have you believe, but concerned citizens and patriots. I will represent them in this courtroom, such as it is, because no matter where we are, we can show that these men and women were acting on your behalf for the benefit of all future generations. I will demonstrate that the real victims in this sad state of affairs are you and everyone else in the solar system. You are the victims of a stolen legacy that should instead be carefully preserved for posterity. Now, granted, one cannot entirely approve of their methods, or perhaps they were overly zealous, but their motivation was highly honorable. I would even go so far as to say their actions were selfless in terms of intentions. No lives were lost, but some pride was no doubt badly damaged. For this, perhaps, the defendants should apologize, but by no means be punished. If anything, they were interfering with the scandalous exploitation of our environment. Nation's harvest is not just there for the taking by anyone who can afford the ships to go out there. It is a decision that must be left to experts who can weigh all of the consequences for our actions in the present. In the interest of fairness, we must let those who speak for all of the people make such crucial decisions that affect all of our lives and the lives of our children. Thank you. Sitting near the rear, Ferniko Haruta only partially hid her gagging motion from Trevor and Eust. Eust had to fight to keep from laughing. He didn't know whether he hoped the cameras had caught it or not. Trevor saw that the Cabal was going to use this trial as a platform for their annexation project. More eyes were on this courtroom than anything broadcast in the last 10 years. VLC's drones were still monitoring the military reserve day and night. Equipment and troops were massing, but not at the rate that he might have expected. Maybe he thought this trial would win over the public and military occupation would not be necessary. Then again, when did that ever stop them? There were always useful idiots to put on the nets supporting the troops, but not the war. Miss Gallagher had Eust on the stand now. He had told of where he was when he heard his engines and train of fuel tankers were lost. He talked of how he had to inform the families right away, and then his brother, Boss, who was still out there working on Titan. The courtroom heard how he and the families prayed for the return of their loved ones and the joy at seeing them again. He talked about how his friend Trevor Van Leeuwan had saved his company and the dream of his brother and himself. Van Leeuwan drove a hard bargain, he said, but not as hard as it could have been. He, too, was rooting for his success. Ms. Gallagher asked, "So, Mr. Van Gelder, do you believe that Titan Fuels is raping the environment?" He answered, "Well, when my brother Bas started his plant by the hydrocarbon lakeshore, he did not have to post any no swimming signs. It is minus 180 degrees C on Titan." This got a chuckle from the audience, which the arbiter gavelled down. She continued, "Do you believe that you are working against the future of your children or anyone else's?" Van Gelder replied, "Well, I am feeding my 6 children by providing fuel for others, and when we trade, I hope to feed their children, so I would say no. I provide fuel that is cheaper for a lot of people who would rather spend that savings on their children than on fuel. Besides, if there is no present for my children, then how can they have a future?" The defense counsel, Biddle, asked, "Mr. Van Gelder, who authorized you and your brother to harvest hydrocarbons on Titan?" Yost looked puzzled. "When my brother Bas had this idea, we both went to Titan to explore and to test whether or not such an idea would work. No one else was even interested. The few people we spoke to about it, like our insurance company, said the idea was unworkable. No one was living on Titan, and no one had claimed rights to harvest. It was our hard work developing a valuable resource that brought it to anyone's attention in the first place. In short, no one authorized anything because the question is absurd." Mr. Biddle continued, "Don't you think it would be better left to the experts to decide such things?" Yost looked a little angry now and replied, "Mr. Biddle, who do you think are more expert or more qualified to analyze Titan's resources than the Van Gelders? How many people do you know who have worked in temperatures of minus 180 degrees Celsius for months on end, building pumping stations and plants, processing fuel, and the list goes on?" Biddle replied, "Well now, we have plenty of activities in Antarctica for hundreds of years." Van Gelder replied, "Yes, and all of the facilities in the Antarctic are run by governments. Look at them. They are like waste dumps, scars on the land. Look at what the state-owned oil drilling has done in Nigeria, Russia, Venezuela, and the list goes on. Look at the busted pipes and oil leaking into the seas and wetlands. People who do this for a living cannot afford to spill a drop or lose good workers to accidents. Those who steal resources in the name of the people never had anything to lose in the first place, so they are wasteful." Biddle realized his team should have done more research on this witness. Gallagher showed video from the ship's log of the Kananobu Maru. There was a poker game going on and some other crewmen dancing. Some of the crewmen were laughing and joking about stuffing the original crew members into the escape pods. One of the crew asked, "Why does Coniston think we need to scare these people so badly?" Another said, "It's all a ploy to make them afraid so we can get bigger budgets in the future. It's kind of a job security thing." He laughed. The logs were not whole, but there were bits and pieces of personal logs and videos they had taken of each other, found by the forensics teams. All of the evidence was prominently date and time stamped. Some showed people suited up in body armor, dripping with weapons, grenades, zip ties, or other paraphernalia. Many were shown in this attire, taking off their helmets, becoming identifiable as the people in the courtroom. Pressure suits were personalized, so the suits were then matched with the defendants. Crewmen from Haruta Metals and Titan Fuels, along with others, including VLC, were shown marching at gunpoint with their hands tied. Don Gallagher put up a chart showing stills from the logs in one column, with lines to mugshot photos of the people in the room. All were tied to scenes of handling stolen cargo and or manhandling the victim crews. She listed all of the crimes to which people were directly tied or could be shown as accessories. She called forensics experts from 2 separate agencies to testify to the authenticity of the video evidence and the matches made to the defendants. The famous Stephen Linford Biddle II stipulated to their authenticity, to everyone's surprise. Next, prosecuting attorney Gallagher called in a renowned forensic psychologist, Dr. Ben Moskowitz. She played the logs containing Commander Kynaston's pep talks to the crews, and more than one planning session to indicate the conspiracy. She played forensic team video tours of the living areas aboard the stolen ships containing personal items of those taking part in the hijackings. There were additional logs showing all of them relaxing or roughhousing. Dr. Moskowitz, after viewing these clips, is it your opinion that the defendants shown are under any kind of duress? Do they act as if they're being forced to be there? Moskowitz replied, "No, ma'am. They appear quite at ease in their surroundings and comfortable with each other." Don continued, "So what would you say is the mindset of the defendants here?" Dr. Moskowitz paused and said, "They show a lot of camaraderie and enthusiasm for what they are doing. From the looks of their quarters, one could say they have made these vessels their home for the foreseeable future. Their commander, Kynaston, appears overall pleased with them and their training, though he was not handling the setback of the Philo T. Farnsworth well. He is not used to losing," Gallagher said. "Dr. Moskowitz, are you familiar with the Stanford prison experiment?" The psychologist replied, "Yes, it is standard case study in any school of psychiatry." The prosecutor asked, "Could you describe it for us briefly, sir?" "Well, yes, to summarize," said Dr. Moskowitz, "it was an experiment done by Dr. Philip Zimbardo in the late 20th century, 1973, at Stanford University, California. A number of students volunteered to participate in an experiment where half would play the part of prisoners and the other would be guards. In a very short time, though it was only an experiment, the guards became cruel and sadistic, and the prisoners became withdrawn and submissive. The experiment had to be stopped early because it got out of hand." "Thank you, Doctor. And from what you have seen, does it appear that the defendants were adopting this behavior?" "Objection, Arbiter. Relevance?" shot Biddle. Gallagher said, "Goes to state of mind of the defendants." In a monotone, Becker said, "Overruled." The prosecutor continued, "So in your opinion, Doctor, the state of mind of the defendants is one of righteous authority?" Sitting back, he said, "That would be my assessment. They feel they have a moral high ground, and that somehow the end justifies the means. What's more, they feel this righteousness comes from a higher place, this Commander Kynaston and people above him." The prosecution has no further questions at this time. The lawyer from Navy Legal Services, Lieutenant Commander Achaeus Rutherford, stood to cross-examine Dr. Moskowitz. "Doctor, would you say these clips show the same camaraderie demonstrated by soldiers or police officers?" The doctor replied, "Yes, that would be a very good comparison." Rutherford continued, "And is it often true that such occupations engender a harsh way of speaking as a way of emboldening themselves for action?" Thinking for a second, Moskowitz answered, "Yes, it is true. Sometimes it is called the hot pursuit syndrome. It is a behavior exhibited before a fight or flight choice, usually fight, but often it becomes habit to people who are afraid of losing their edge, as they say. In a significant number of cases, they escalate through their force continuum at a runaway pace. I might add, though, if we are speaking of psychological profiles, the now defunct Federal Bureau of Investigation studies showed that police and serial killers exhibit the very same behaviors in terms of the power dynamic." Finally, Rutherford asked, "So, Doctor, is this behavior that authorities exhibit, say, before going after poachers who may be armed?" Don Gallagher jumped up. "Objection, Arbiter. My clients are not on trial here." Arbiter Becker noted. "Sustained." Rutherford said, "I withdraw the question. Thank you, Dr. Moskowitz. I have nothing further with this witness." James Kaokai looked nervous on the witness stand, but when he spoke it was always with authority. Don Gallagher displayed the satellite images and data from VLC showing 3 stolen craft parked at the Northern Military Reserve. She asked, "Mr. Kaokai, do you recognize these images?" He replied, "Yes, ma'am. Those are the 3 craft that had been missing for some time. That one there in the foreground is the Nakamura Maru. The others are the Nome and the Klondike, owned by Midnight Sun Mining." She then asked, "Please read the date stamps on the video from the satellite photos." James complied. Then she said, "Mr. Kaokai, I understand that you are familiar with the ship's logs data shown earlier. Could you read the dates and times for those of Commander Kynaston being aboard each one?" Kaokai carefully read the dates. "Now do you see any matching dates there, Mr. Kaokai?" Gallagher asked. He named off several when she continued. "So, Mr. Kaokai, as Director of Space Operations, have you ever landed your ships in the Northern or Equatorial Military Reserves?" James sat back. "As long as I have been Director, I have never seen it done. We have so little business with governments and none with military. I don't see how it would ever happen." Gallagher said, "Back to the dates of the logs showing the crew with Commander Kynaston. How far back would you say are the oldest?" Kaokai said, "Well, ma'am, not having them here and including the plasma engines, I can only say I was surprised to see dates as old as over 2 Mars years." Lieutenant Commander Rutherford approached the witness stand. "Mr. Kaokai, did you attempt to contact anyone in the JSO or the Northern Military Reserve regarding the status of your ships there? And if not, could you enlighten us as to why?" James replied, "No, sir, I did not. It has been my experience and that of my company that government agencies are very economical with the truth. If we wish to recover our property, it would be best not to alert those who stole it in the first place." "Objection, inflammatory," shouted Biddle. "Strike that last sentence of the witness, please," Becker said to the clerk. Rutherford resumed questioning. "So, you decided not to pursue the recovery of your property through channels, is that fair to say?" James replied, "Yes, long experience has taught us that communications pointing out incompetence or malevolence in government agencies is the quickest way for them to clam up. After that, it could take years of lawsuits seeking answers, never leading to satisfaction. The best plan was to obtain evidence for probable cause." "That is all for now, Arbiter." Rutherford sat down, and Stephen Biddle moved to the stand. "Mr. Kaokai, as Director of Space Operations, you are aware of the increased smuggling we are experiencing?" James answered, "I'm not aware of it. I suppose it depends upon one's definition of smuggling, because there's no such crime on the frontier." "And to which we are you referring?" Biddle looked annoyed, but continued, "I'm talking about the influx of precious metals, hydrocarbons, and rare earths that are showing up in the markets, but not at customs stations." James said, "No, I was not aware of that. You know, a lot of new alloys are being invented on the frontier, and products are being fabricated there. Doesn't customs make even more money on the higher value added?" Biddle continued, "Be that as it may, are you aware of a process called asset forfeiture, the seizing of assets associated with the commitment of a crime?" James responded, "I never considered mining to be a crime, only injurious practices. But as to forfeiture, yes, I believe many people call that theft, or punishment without due process, even on Earth." Biddle let that go. "Mr. Kaokai, the we I referred to are the great masses of the solar system. Do you not believe it is they who are wronged by the inadequate collection of customs duties, or the flooding of the market with cheaper commodities or goods?" Kaokai said, "On the contrary, as a consumer, why would I wish to pay more for everything except quality and have fewer choices? Why would I not want manufacturers with a profit motive to produce more cheaply and competitively by finding new resources, or to even produce at all. That is a far greater boon to society than handing over money to people who don't understand it. Money itself is the best example. Governments artificially manipulate its value and in turn injure billions of people at a time. It happens every 10 to 15 Earth years like clockwork. Biddle, clearly frustrated, sat down. No further questions at this time, Arbiter. Chapter 34. The Experts. The Pirates trial, as it was now known, had recessed for the weekend. Back at his home and office, Roberto relayed a handwritten message to Trevor, brought by a courier, a quaint notion, but still very useful in this day and age. The message read, "To Patrick, he wants to meet you tonight, 8:15 p.m. Sean." Trevor, of course, was Patrick, and Mick was Sean. This was the cloak and dagger routine they all thought was over the top until someone tried murdering him, Trevor thought. He had not told the other two about that yet. Changing cabs a couple of times, Van Leeuwan made his way back to the Francis Drake. General Campbell was early and already seated at a rear booth. Mick had set a reserve sign on it, which he normally would not do on a Saturday night. Trevor noticed Campbell was dressed in street clothes once again as he made his way over and sat down. Campbell was up for another bacon cheeseburger, so Trevor caught Mick's eye and held up 2 fingers. Quickly, the waitress came over with 2 fresh beers. Giamba started. "I thought we would have met again before now, but I'm getting to know a thing or two. I've got some good oil on those armaments for you." He slid a glossy brochure across the table. Inside was a picture of a modern-looking spacecraft with the railgun turrets used on some of the modified miners' craft. The fancy transcript at the top read Berkeley Arms. He slid another over showing an image of a pursuit craft perfectly matching the ones that oversaw the Farnsworth incident. Inside was an article describing how specialty coders had perfected the sensor and navigation software for this new police/military vehicle. The rest of the folder contained brochures for various other implements of state control, from body armor to full-on battlecruisers. Trevor scanned through them, but there were many. "I had not thought there were that many people on the gravy train, but I'm not at all surprised," he said. "Of course, specialty coders is in there, as always. Conan Dietrich is not going to withdraw his hand, and all of these guys sit on each other's boards of directors. I still wouldn't set foot on any ship Dietrich was involved with." Campbell said, "Then there's Kynaston and that other cricketer, Sir Richard Marchand. I heard them talking about how so many of their stock options will be vesting in the near future." Van Leeuwan said, "Well, at least their behavior is consistent with their forefathers. They never take anything but a sure bet. Have you been following the trial so far?" The general laughed and said, "Of course, I wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm Australian and true blue, but if these guys burn, I won't cry over them." Trevor said, "From the looks of things, Kynaston will probably go down for conspiracy. But is there anything that links the conspiracy to Aldrich, Dietrich, Marchand, or any other fixers?" Giamba took another long sip of his beer. "Funny you should ask that, mate. Rank has its privileges, so I made up a reason to go walkabout in the Northern Military Reserve. They really didn't like me there asking so many questions, but I told them it was a military necessity. Our base had to have a working knowledge of the other." Van Leeuwan moved closer across the table, speaking low. "Are you sure you saw everything up there?" Campbell asked. "What do you mean, mate?" Trevor said. "I mean everything. The Northern Reserve appears to be connected to a secret base much closer to Olympus Mons via long tunnels and lava tubes." He then took out his viewer, indicating the scans of the other base, along with video taken from a drone riding on a vehicle. Giamba clearly saw now that the two bases were connected. Crikey, man, they really pulled the wool over my eyes. They said they were just enlarging the reserve a bit. Trevor said, "They're doing more than that, Jamba. They are preparing for some kind of invasion or occupation. Look at all of this equipment here. I could see their phony justifications seeping into the trial. Just wait until the defense gets going. The bullshit is going to rain down hard." Jamba looked at more of Trevor's images and video. Yes, that is exactly what they would use to occupy a large civilian area and do it quickly. 1,000, maybe 2,000 troops. But there's no sign of them. I would know if there was that level of deployment. That cannot be easily hidden. There's something going on east of the reserve. Otherwise, they would just hollow out space for the troops and leave the vehicles camouflaged. Trevor said, "That's why I asked about linking these others higher up the chain of command and into the civilian authority. We'll never get half of the big kahunas in custody here, but exposing them might slow down this pointless escalation. Soldiers on Earth are not supposed to follow illegal orders. On the frontier, everyone in that chain of command is a co-conspirator." Van Leeuwan went on to tell the general about barely escaping an attempt on his life made by Levesque and the latter's reputation in French Polynesia, a la Lavoisier. Campbell said, "Yes, it sounds like someone put a hit out on you, and I am doubly glad you prevailed. Let me do some digging into this Levesque character. There could be more precise information in the military records if he was French Foreign Legion or a Franco-German regular." Trevor finally told Campbell of a pep talk given to officers at the Northern Reserve, along with kudos from a bevy of world leaders. Jamba was shocked and amazed, but not angry. "I should have mentioned it, but I did not see all of the preparations until now. It looked like another mock exercise. I won't ask how you knew about that, but since you do, you probably know I was there." Van Leeuwan replied, "Yes, and as I recall, you were not very excited about it. Can you get the official logs?" Stephen Linford Biddle II had to draw on that confidence of entitlement and sheer bluster that had brought him to the pinnacle of his career. The defense calls Dr. Ambrose Sorensen to the stand. A tall, distinguished-looking man of about 70 took the stand and was sworn in. "Now, Dr. Sorensen, could you tell us your qualifications, please?" Clearing his throat, Dr. Sorensen said, "I have a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Chicago, and I am a professor and head of the sociology department at UC Berkeley. I have written 3 textbooks on sociology concentrating on government institutions." Biddle started in. "So, Professor, you specialize in government institutions with particular interest in both theory of government and law enforcement, is that correct?" Leaning forward, the professor said, "Yes, sir, that is correct." Biddle then asked, "Then, sir, what, may I ask, is the prevailing theory of government? By that, I mean, why do governments exist?" "Objection. Relevance," shot Gallagher. Biddle said, "It goes to the state of mind of my clients." Arbiter Beck said tentatively, "Overruled. You may answer the question, Professor." Professor Sorensen then said, "Well, sir, the theory of government is that there exists a social contract, which is a tacit agreement for how we treat each other in society. A government is that which oversees us all and guarantees that we do treat each other fairly, or for those who do not, they are punished or corrected in some way." Biddle added, "Professor, do you believe that my clients were acting to ensure this fairness? Were they acting as a government?" The professor was a bit hesitant, but said, "Perhaps their methods were overzealous, but yes, I believe they were acting as a government or their agents." Biddle continued, "In what ways do you believe the defendants were acting as a government in protecting us all?" The professor said, "They were following the orders of a higher-level government employee, Commander Kynaston. They were helping to rein in the illegal collection of resources from the outer solar system." Trevor thought, well, if this witness was not thoroughly coached, then he did not know what coaching was. Biddle continued, "And according to what you have seen, have the rules of asset forfeiture been followed properly?" Gaining confidence, the professor said, "Why, of course, the craft taken were the very same that were being used to transport smuggled goods. This makes them fair game for forfeiture." Biddle ended. "The defense has no more questions, Arbiter." Don Gallagher approached the witness stand. "Hello, Professor. Let's go through the testimony you just gave, shall we? Let's start with the social contract. Is this a real contract?" Ambrose said, "Well, no, ma'am. We take it as being true implicitly." Don came back. "So there's no social contract, no written document there?" The professor said, "No, but..." Cutting him off, Gallagher said, "Thank you, Doctor. Now, how does this government come about, which you say guarantees fairness?" Ambrose said, "In the United States, there is the Constitution, which gives us our rights." Gallagher said, "So are you saying that no one in the United States had rights before the Constitution? What about human rights?" Slightly peeved, the professor answered, "Of course I'm not saying that. The Constitution guarantees rights that all people should have. Rights existed before the Constitution." Gallagher continued, "So what about the Declaration of Independence? Did that document not say that when the rights of man are trampled so thoroughly by government that they have the right to rise up and throw off that government and to institute a new one?" The professor said, "Exactly." The prosecutor said, "And what if they do not wish to institute a new government, having been shown how badly they defend liberty?" Ambrose said, "People cannot live without government. People cannot manage themselves. There would be chaos." "That's one way of looking at it, Professor," said Gallagher. "Another way of looking at it is peaceful people must have freedom of choice. By the requirement of your government, did the defendants identify themselves as government agents?" The professor said, "Well, I did not hear that specifically, no." The prosecutor continued, "Professor, are all governments equally valid? I mean, is the government of China more or less valid than the government of the UK? China has a constitution which looks very much like that of the US. Professor Ambrose looked really uncomfortable now. "Well, no, not all governments treat their people the same way." Gallagher then asked, "Did the people of China, Brazil, or the United States choose to have the governments that they do? Does a baby make a choice at birth whether or not he or she wants to live under a government?" The professor said, "Well, not exactly. People in China did not choose, or their Communist Party or their army chose. In the other two, the people voted." The prosecutor asked, "Did everyone in the 13 colonies vote for the U.S. Constitution?" The professor answered, "Well, no, women were not allowed to vote, nor slaves or people who did not own property." "I see," said Don. "And of those that voted for the Constitution, how many are left alive? Did anyone alive today vote for it?" Professor Sorensen said, "Well, implicitly, it assumed that they would approve." Gallagher then asked, "When bureaucrats change rules which have the force of law, who votes for that?" Sorensen said, "No one." The prosecutor said, "When a citizen has a grievance, why must they have to spend large amounts of money to sue for action? Can you explain how the government is ensuring fairness?" The professor looked drained. "I don't know. I just don't know." Sitting back down, Don Gallagher said, "No further questions for this witness." Next, Mr. Biddle called as his witness Dr. Natasha Ularu. "Dr. Ularu, could you give everyone a synopsis of your qualifications, please?" Leaning forward, she spoke softly. "I have a law degree from Oxford, as well as a PhD in international relations from Oxford. I have served as ambassador to the United Nations from Romania. Currently, I am at the European Institute of Government." Biddle said, "That's very impressive. How familiar are you with the new settlements and the Mars frontier?" Dr. Ularu leaned forward again and said, "I'm very familiar with those settlements. I have written several papers on them in the last few years." Biddle continued, "And what was the crux of those papers? What did they concern?" Smoothing her hair out of her eye, she said, "My thesis is that it is time for these communities to be folded in under some kind of governmental auspices. They have no regulatory agencies, public schooling, nor do they have any controls over industrialization or natural resources, zoning, licensing, or certifications, nor the many other aspects we attribute to civilized society." Stephen Linford Biddle II asked, "What do you think was the purpose of the defendants in the bigger picture?" Playing with her brooch, she answered, "I believe they have served a purpose in demonstrating what the dangers are in moving out into the solar system without protection." Several people in the audience had to suppress their laughter, including Trevor, Eust, and Fernico. The problem was that she said it with a totally straight face. Biddle then asked, "There are rumors that many of the ships venturing out there are armed, so that should solve the problem, right?" To this she became indignant. "No, that is awful. Violence only brings more violence. Look what just happened. The JSO was attacked by ships with guns. Someone could have been killed. Only police and soldiers should have guns." Biddle then asked, "Based upon your vast education and experience, do you feel my clients were acting in the best interest of human rights and fairness?" The think tank expert replied, "Yes, of course. They were acting under orders from people who know better. Though their undercover behavior was excessive, they were effective and patriotic. The resources of the solar system belong to everyone." Biddle said, "No further questions, Arbiter." Don Gallagher approached the witness stand. "Dr. Ularu, have you ever spent time in the new settlements?" She said, "I spent 4 days there last Earth year and a week the year before that." Gallagher asked, "And what research did you do in the settlements? Who did you speak with to form the thesis you related to Mr. Biddle?" She thought, "Oh, I came in a group and I spoke mostly to them. I did speak with a few shopkeepers, restaurant owners, vehicle repair, etc., but for my papers I mostly did library research and went over past papers from the Institute." Don continued, "These shopkeepers you spoke with, did any of them have any complaints? Were they plagued by shoplifters, graffiti, shortages of supplies, lack of customers, anything?" Dr. Ularu looked thoughtful. "No, come to think of it, they did not have a single complaint. But they just don't know how much better their lives could be." Gallagher then asked, "Dr. Ularu, do you remember how many of the business people had transplanted to the new settlements?" The government expert said, "Oh, almost all of them had. They saved their money to go there and start their businesses." Going further, was there anything that struck you in particular about the frontier? Dr. Ularu twirled her long hair for a second, then, "Oh, everything was so clean and nice. The plants all trimmed perfectly, but there were a lot of people wearing guns." Gallagher then asked, "And what did you think of that? Did you feel unsafe at all?" Dr. Ularu said, "Well, at first I was very afraid, but in just a few hours I didn't see them at all. People were so lovely and polite." Gallagher went further. "So, may I ask, do you have children, Dr. Ularu?" She said, "Yes, I have 2, a boy 8 and a girl 10, Earth years, that is." The prosecutor said, "Okay, play along with me now. Hypothetically, you are home alone with your children, and 2 men break into your house with giant crowbars and are coming after you. Would you rather have a loaded gun in your hand or a phone?" Biddle jumped in. "Objection, relevance," Gallagher said. "Mr. Becker, I'm making a point about situational ethics." "Overruled," said Becker. Ularu panicked and asked the arbiter, "Do I have to answer that?" Becker said, "Yes, and you are under oath." Almost crying, she said, "I would want the gun." Gallagher then asked, "Dr. Ularu, would you like a tissue? No? Okay. Let me ask you this. Hypothetically, at your institute, could you or any of your colleagues write a paper about the new settlements demonstrating how clean and safe they are? or about the low cost of living, or the lack of constant fees, payments, and taxes that really do not improve anyone's life? She looked at Becker again and said, no, no one could write such a paper because they would never get money to write another. Gallagher then inquired, Dr. Laru, where does your institute get its funding? The PhD replied, we get it from all of the European countries that support it. Prosecutor, and where do they get it? From taxation? Ularo, yes. Gallagher, do people pay these taxes voluntarily? Ularo, yes, no, not really. They would go to jail if they didn't. Gallagher, do you think the people paying taxes want to read your papers? Ularo, mostly people at other institutes and universities read them. Gallagher, so people are paying money for services they really don't want. Ularo, I suppose that is true. I never really thought about it. Gallagher, do you think it would be right for you to use my services because I threatened to put you in jail if you didn't? Ularo, of course not. That would be criminal. Gallagher, so it is all right if a government does it, but not all right for me to do it? Ularo, yes, that's right. Gallagher, aren't governments just made up of people? Ularo, people work in government, which serves the people. Gallagher, do you think stealing is wrong? Do you teach your children to steal? Of course it's wrong. I would never teach my children to steal. Gallagher, do you think the defendants were stealing or taxing? Ularo, I don't know anymore. You make it sound like they are the same thing. Don said, okay, let's try this. As a member of an international institute with a PhD in international studies, are you a believer in the right to self-determination? Ularo, well, yes. Peoples have a right to determine their own futures. Gallagher, you say peoples, plural. What about people as individuals? Don't they have the right to determine their own future as long as they are not harming anyone else? Ularo, self-determination means you have the right to have your own country. Gallagher, what if the population of my group is just me? Is there a lower limit to the size of your countries? Ularo, some countries are pretty small. Gallagher, so my neighbors and I can form a country then? Ularo, no. If you were a country, you would need permission from them. Biddle jumped in. Objection, Mr. Becker. Could the counselor tell us where this is going? Don turned to the arbiter and said, goes to motive, sir. Overruled, said Becker as he sat back. Gallagher continued, but what about my right of self-determination? Is that out the window now that I'm actually trying to achieve it? I don't want a war. I just want independence. Ularo, if you are a part of a country, you have to ask permission. Gallagher, I understand that people have the right to be left alone and not have their stuff stolen by arbitrary authority. It sounds like the right of self-determination is not a serious thing, and neither are property rights when it comes to governments. Is that correct? Ularo, I don't know anymore. Yes. Gallagher, we are in the home stretch now. You say the defendants were acting together, taking orders from Commander Kynaston, and he was taking orders from somebody else, higher up. Ularo, yes, that's right. That's what the video shows. Gallagher, they were all there at the JSO base together, and they were not under arrest. Ularo, yes, that's what it shows. Gallagher, so it looks like the JSO were working with the defendants. Is that why there was no intervention in the Farnsworth incident? Ularo, it appears they were working together. Gallagher, now I'm going to show you an additional video to see if this corroborates your testimony today. Mr. Becker, I have new evidence I would like to introduce. May I transfer it to the court computer? Becker said, hold on, Ms. Gallagher. I would like to review this evidence first, since it is being introduced so late. Please meet me in chambers with the defense counsel before I allow it to be admitted. This session will recess for 2 hours. Will that be sufficient, Ms. Gallagher? In the arbiter's chambers, Gallagher uploaded the video that the VLC drone shot in the conference room with Sir Richard Marchand, pepping up the crowd. The presidents, prime ministers, MPs, government contractors, and think tank experts all adding their 2 cents worth, all in support of annexation and making sure they bragged about their individual contributions to the project. The blood drained from Stephen Biddle III's face as he watched. Of course, he knew almost every one of the people giving the pep talk. The Navy lawyer, Lieutenant Commander Rutherford, also knew several of those pictured, but said nothing. Finally, Biddle put himself back together and said, "Where's the relevance of this video? None of those people are on trial." Gallagher piped in, "Your witness broached the conspiracy angle, so this is relevant. Clearly, there has been a conspiracy to terrorize frontier residents, and the electorates as well. Kynaston takes his orders from Sir Richard Marchand. Both are MI6. Biddle waved off her rebuttal. "Look at this video from the angle and the way it's put together. Clearly, it is not a log of any official meeting. This looks like fruit of the poisonous tree." Mr. Becker asked, "Ms. Gallagher?" "What say you?" Gallagher said, "This was given to Frontier Threat Management and obtained through standard probable cause practices by Trevor Van Leeuwan." "There it comes," shouted Biddle, as Rutherford rolled his eyes. "He strikes again, the Martian Robin Hood. We should have guessed," Becker said. "Enough editorializing, all right? Let me tell you what I'm going to do. I have some problems with the video as well, but we do not have time to stop the trial indefinitely for further investigation. I will allow it on one condition, and that is you have substantial corroborating evidence and testimony. I will recess this court for 2 days, and if these requirements are not met, there will be no video. Will that make everyone happy?" When everyone came out of chambers, Biddle and Rutherford were beaming. It was Gallagher who looked troubled. Chapter 35. Stand off or stand down. Next, it was Van Leeuwan's turn to be disappointed when he learned about the video. He was confident the court would accept it, but understood why Becker had balked. He did not want even the appearance of the frontier courts going down that slippery slope of corruption that was SOP back on Earth. Even if General Campbell got Trevor the official copy, the result would have been the same. Perhaps it was enough that he and others in the new settlements knew of their plans. He received an emergency call from VLC Space Operations Center. It was Ka'okai on the viewer, always looking cool, but Trevor could hear the agitation in his voice. "Trevor, sir, we're getting some disturbing images from the Northern Military Reserve. I'm sending them now over your other channel." Van Leeuwan looked at the satellite images of the reserve. In a sort of time lapse, more and more APCs were appearing parked at a large cleared area near the base. Several had missile launchers, though more had non-lethal crowd control weapons such as sonic and microwave arrays. All had built-in machine guns, which were never removed. James came back on. "Mr. Van Leeuwan, that's not all. Remember, we did not see the personnel to match all of that equipment? Well, that's been changing over the last 24 hours. Troop ships have been landing regularly with maybe 100 at a time. We don't know for sure. We're trying to match the external with the internal surveillance. There's a lot of activity down there." Trevor told Ka'okai to maintain a good record of the satellite imagery and to keep him posted. If they started to move out, he was to track them and send him the data in real time. He wrote out a quick note, sealed it, and handed it to Roberto to get it delivered. Van Leeuwan thought to himself, "Those bastards are finally doing it. They're really going to take off their masks and let people see how ugly their view of the world is." Then he called in his own chief of security to beef up the VLC facilities and approaches. He had a conference call with several other CEOs and vital services along with Frontier Threat Management to give them a heads up. They decided that the invaders would need at least 2 to 3 days to come overland from that distance, on top of making their way down into the Valles Marineris to ready their attack. Maybe so, but no one was taking any chances. Hours later, the first columns of APCs were moving southeast toward Daedalus Planum, and at a pretty good pace. Earth, Moon, Mars, and all outposts were buzzing over this unanticipated break in the trial. What evidence could this prosecutor possibly be talking about? And why did the defense look like the cat that swallowed the canary? There was nothing to do but wait. On the morning the trial was to resume, Kaokai contacted Trevor to tell him that the convoys had been sighted in the west end of the Valles Marineris. Evidently, they had scouted an easier way down than what VLC maps had indicated. The canyons were notoriously tricky to map, like those on Earth in Utah, which defied mapping into the 21st century. None of that mattered, because movement on the valley floor would be faster now. The defendants, attorneys, arbiter, victims, and public had assembled in the courtrooms to resume the prosecution's phase of the trial. Becker gavelled, "This court is now in session. Ms. Gallagher, I understand you have new evidence and new testimony for us." To everyone's surprise, Don said, "Mr. Becker, the prosecution would like to call General Giamba Campbell of the Australian Defence Force." The people in the courtroom were looking at each other, along with the defendants and their lawyers. Mr. Becker asked, "Ms. Gallagher, what is the purpose of this testimony today?" She replied, "General Campbell is a corroborating witness with corroborating evidence to that which I attempted to introduce before the recess." Becker, looking a bit surprised, said, "Very well, Miss Gallagher, your witness." Don approached the general, who had been sworn in by this time. "General, I understand that you have some evidence regarding the conspiracy of depriving my clients of their property, businesses, and basic natural rights. What is this evidence?" Campbell answered, "Ma'am, it is an official transcript of a meeting held at the Northern Military Reserve regarding the plans for invasion and annexation of the new settlements and facilities." The courtroom crowd erupted in a low rumble of conversation, to which Becker gavelled, "Order, silence during these proceedings. Thank you, Miss Gallagher." Don said, "Thank you, Mr. Becker. Okay, General Campbell, how long have you been in the Australian Defence Force?" The general leaned forward. "I have been in the force for 27 years. Gallagher continued, "That is quite a long time. Did you consider that before you decided to come forward with this information?" Giamba looked up and out over the crowd. "Yes, I did. I had wrestled with my conscience for some time. This is quite possibly a career-ending event for me, and I come from a military family." Gallagher let that sink in for a few seconds. "So, General Campbell, could you tell the court how you came by this evidence? This transcript?" Giamba said, "In the course of my duties, I have certain functions, such as limited oversight over the other bases on Mars. I have access to many of the records in order for me to get up to speed on operations here." Ms. Gallagher then asked, "Mr. Becker, I would like to enter this transcript into evidence, please." Becker motioned to the clerk and said, "So entered. You may proceed." The prosecutor then asked, "What else can you tell the court about this meeting so that we may verify its authenticity?" The general said, "Ma'am, I also attended this meeting. I was not enthusiastic about it. I have not been posted on Mars very long, and I was shocked by what I was seeing." Don then asked, "Mr. Becker, may I now enter the official version of the meeting provided by General Campbell here?" Becker said, "You may enter the video into the court record, Madam Prosecutor." Then he motioned to the clerk. Gallagher then said, "Mr. Becker, may I play the video for the court?" The courtroom was deathly silent as they watched and listened to the words that would render all of them slaves once again, to some abstract, violent hierarchy. The reactions varied from shock to recognition to seething anger, but they stayed calm, with only a low buzzing of conversation at the start. When it ended, the courtroom erupted. It was pandemonium in what was normally a very businesslike place. Becker banged slowly on his gavel as the din quieted down. Becker said, "Miss Gallagher, you may resume questioning the witness." Gallagher said, "Now, General Campbell, do the video and transcript match with what you saw when you were attending the meeting?" Campbell answered, "In my opinion, yes. This is by all definition a conspiracy. You have several players there, some providing manpower, some with equipment. There is a plan with a timetable and everybody knows their place in it. The plan is for the unlawful taking of the people and property of the Mars frontier, as well as the rest of the resources in the entire solar system. It's monumental in its hubris and in the arrogance of the planners. The piracy scheme was just the tip of the iceberg." Don Gallagher said, "Thank you, General Campbell. We have no further questions." Stephen Linford Biddle II just sat there with his face in his hands. He knew his employers would be all over him if he didn't cross-examine. But what was the point? This trial was over. He could try to appeal, but he was not hopeful of doing it in a Mars frontier courtroom. In any case, they would be replacing him no matter what happened in the next 10 minutes. Rutherford was not feeling much better. He stood up anyway and approached the witness stand. "General Campbell, I trust you have made a distinguished career in the Australian Defence Force. What must your family think of you now? Why would you betray your service, your country, and the people of Earth and Mars by stealing classified information?" General Campbell straightened up in his chair. "Sir, I resent any accusations you have made regarding my loyalties. I took an oath to uphold the principles of the service and my country, which includes protecting them from both internal and external threats. This includes the exposure and non-compliance with illegal orders." Biddle continued, "I don't understand. Once the areas in question were annexed, the orders would be perfectly valid. You would be subduing only rebels at that point. So please explain." The general paused a moment, then leaned forward. "Going along with piracy is not legal. This was not privateering. No letters of marque were issued, as there was no declared enemy. I don't see the legality of annexation either. I did not sign up to the military for conquest. Waging an aggressive war, i.e., an unprovoked war against non-combatants, is a war crime, in spite of how many presidents and prime ministers engage in it. How can you call people rebels for wanting to hold on to what they have created with their own two hands? You see, Australia was once very much like the frontier, dry, deadly, and difficult just to survive, but resources enough to make a home for some. My ancestors made their homes there and lived off the land. They may have even welcomed newcomers if they shared their technology and traded for what we knew. They may have adopted the concept of property rights if the rules had not kept changing. Sinking a well or a mine could make a piece of land suddenly productive, but that should not have meant a small group of people controlling all potentially productive land to dole out to their special friends. That is exactly what is happening here on the frontier. It is Australia all over again." He gave it a shot. Rutherford was not even going to try now. Biddle went back to the defense table. "The defense rests, Mr. Becker." Rutherford stood up also. "The defense rests." The courtroom erupted in a loud cheer. Becker let it go for about 15 seconds, then started the gavel. It took another 10 seconds for the audience to quiet down. Becker said, "Very well, the jury will now enter deliberations." With that, about half of the people filed out of the courtroom, including Trevor, Eust, and Fernico. It was a beautiful, artificial day in front of the Cydonia Decisions Building. Some of the families of the crewmen and other spacefarers came by to wish all of them well. After about half an hour, the newsnet started reporting military columns moving along the floor in the Valles Marineris west of the settlements, but perhaps a day or more away. When the arbiter got wind of it, he immediately sequestered the jury into suites right there at Cydonia Decisions. It was certain they would not even get a whiff of this development or any other while making their decision. Outside was a different story. Everyone in the new settlements wearing sidearms began to check them, as if they did not do that every day. The insurance and security companies rolled out their own weaponry and troops, coordinating with their customers' needs and with each other where they were contracted to do so. Barricades went up in front of homes and businesses. Rations and ammunition were checked. Roadblocks went up before the government sector boundaries. The nuclear power co-op was barricaded with small artillery pieces appearing in the surrounding grounds, with local and contracted guards. In a matter of 6 hours, the new settlements were completely battened down. They were ready to absorb anything to the best of their ability to defend themselves. The news nets were beaming it all over the solar system. The next morning, the jury reported to the courtroom at Cydonia Decisions after their comfortable sequestration to be escorted to the jury room. Malcolm Aldrich and Ambassador Dietrich counted themselves lucky to score a couple of seats inside the courtroom, despite desperate warnings from Lavoisier. Their future was very much on the line. Those seated in the courtroom tried not to make eye contact with the incoming jury. Everybody knew what had transpired but them. After 3 hours, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Everyone had been called and had taken up their seats. The arbiter, Becker, asked, "Has the jury come to a verdict?" To this, the foreman stood up and said, "Yes, Mr. Becker, the jury has reached a verdict in this case." He handed a few sheets of paper to the court guard, who passed it to the judge. The judge began reading the lengthy verdict for each of the many defendants for both shared and individual crimes. By the end, no sympathy had been generated for the defendants. All were found guilty of every crime for which they had been charged, individually and collectively. The jurors had specified several people, based on the evidence, for recommendation of charges in this case. The arbiter thanked the jury for their professionalism and dismissed them. The trial was over. Upon leaving, Van Leeuwan, Haruda, and Van Gelder caught the sight of Ambassador Dietrich and Malcolm Aldrich III being frog-marched to the detention area. Evidently, their crude disguises had not fooled professional investigators. With the end of the trial and the incredible backlash on Earth, Moon, as well as Mars, there was a hesitancy to move forward with annexation for now. The armada to the west mysteriously turned around and returned the way they came. The U.S. Congress had passed the legislation only to have the president veto it. They did not try to override the veto, even though both the votes and their stock options were there to support it. Both Congress and the president tried to save face. Politicians tried to pretend everything was over, and even their pet media went silent. But 53 congressmen and 12 senators resigned or lost their seats in recall elections on both sides. 74 members of parliament lost their seats, along with the British, Australian, and Canadian prime ministers. There were a few coups d'etat, but only a few more than usual. The CCP had a major purge, and no one asked questions. Van Leeuwan was back in his office, directing the construction of his pipeline. Haruda was supplying him with tons of steel, alloys, and fabrication. Joost and Bas van Gelder were driving the longest tanker trains in history. They all marveled at how the people on the frontier pulled together to support one another. But Trevor Van Leeuwan knew it wasn't over. It never was.